Welcome back to my channel.
Bleach, Crimson Kenpachi. Chapter 2, The Gates of Serite. The road out of Rukungai did not become beautiful all at once. It changed the way wounds changed when they began to scar, slowly, unevenly, with the old damage still visible beneath the new surface. Broken roads gave way to paths that were merely worn instead of ruined. The smell of stale blood and smoke thinned into dust, cold stone, and distant water. Fewer people watched from doorways with murder already half decided in their eyes. Fewer hands twitched toward hidden blades when footsteps approached. The nameless boy noticed every difference. He said nothing about them. He walked several steps behind the woman in white, sword hanging loosely at his side, gaze moving constantly between the path ahead. The line of her shoulders, the roofs, the trees, the bends in the road where danger might gather. Habit did not release him just because the world had become quieter. If anything, the quiet made him more alert. Quiet in Rukungai usually meant someone stronger was nearby. The woman ahead of him moved with no such caution. She did not look over her shoulder. She did not scan the trees. She did not adjust her pace when the road narrowed or the shadows deepened. She walked like the road belonged to her. That bothered him. It also fascinated him. He had spent years learning how people moved when they were afraid. Hungry, angry, desperate, tired, drunk, cornered, or pretending to be stronger than they were. He knew the false swagger of men trying to bluff. He knew the brittle stiffness of fighters hiding an injury. He knew the restless glances of thieves measuring escape routes. She moved like none of them. She was not careless. He understood that now. Careless people died. This was something else. Certainty, pure and absolute, as if nothing on the road between Rukungai and wherever she was leading him had the right to inconvenience her. The thought should have irritated him. Instead, it kept drawing his attention back to her. Once, when the path curved around a rocky ridge and the early light slipped through the trees in pale gold shafts, he found himself watching the way her hair shifted in the wind and immediately looked away, annoyed for reasons he could not name. The woman noticed anyway. "You're staring," she said without turning. The boy's grip shifted slightly on his sword. "I'm watching." A faint smile touched her mouth. "Is that what you call it?" "Yes." He expected her to tease him again. Instead, she only nodded once, as if accepting the answer because, for him, it was true. They walked on. The silence between them was not empty. It felt more like the stretch of stillness in a fight just before steel met steel, when both sides knew something mattered and neither had yet chosen what to say. The boy did not mind silence. He trusted it more than speech. But eventually curiosity, which had been sharpening quietly inside him since the moment he left the district behind, pressed hard enough to demand form. "What's your name?" The woman's steps did not slow. For a heartbeat, he thought she would ignore the question. Then she said, "Unohana." He rolled the name once through his mind. Unohana. It did not sound like a fighter's name to him. Not in the way names sounded in Rukungai, thick with threat or swagger or desperation. It sounded calm. Too calm. He frowned slightly. She noticed that too. He looked disappointed. "It doesn't sound dangerous." That made her laugh soft and genuine, and the sound curled strangely through his chest. "Names rarely do," she said. He considered that. It was probably true. A few steps later, she asked, "Do you have one?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The question should have been simple. In another place, for another person, perhaps it would have been. But names required someone to give them, someone to use them, someone to care whether you answered. In the outer districts, he had been called many things, but none of them had ever belonged to him. They were labels thrown from the outside. Warnings, insults, rumors. He had never needed more. "No," he said at last. Unohana glanced back then, just once. There was no pity in her face, only interest. "No name at all?" He shook his head. A loose strand of dark hair moved across her cheek in the wind. "How unusual. It's never been necessary." She turned her gaze forward again, but he saw something change in her expression. Not surprise, not disapproval, something quieter, a kind of thoughtfulness. "Perhaps," she said. "That will change." He did not ask what she meant. If a name became necessary, he would deal with it then. Until that moment, it remained a pointless sound. The road widened as the day wore on. By noon, he could feel it before he saw it. Pressure. Not like hers. Not singular, not focused, not intimate in its danger. This was broader. Layered. A field of presence pressing across the air, woven from many strong spirits existing in relative harmony. To anyone else, it might have felt impressive. Perhaps even comforting. To him, it felt like stepping too close to a place full of blades. His hand settled nearer the hilt of his sword. Unohana did not comment, but her voice changed slightly when she spoke, becoming gentler in the way people sometimes did when approaching an animal they did not want to startle. "We're close." He said nothing. The first glimpse of Sarite came through the trees, a stretch of white wall rising so high and clean against the sky that for a second his mind rejected it as unreal. He stopped walking. The wall stood like a judgment, immaculate, ancient, impossible. Every rough instinct inside him tightened at once. He had seen large buildings before, in richer inner districts, but nothing like this. Nothing built with such confidence. Nothing so obviously made by people who had never expected it to fall. Unohana walked 3 more steps before realizing he was no longer behind her. She turned. He stood in the road with his sword hanging loose and his eyes fixed on the distant wall as if it had personally offended him. "What is that?" Her expression softened by a degree. "Sarite, the place you came from?" "Yes." He looked at her, then back at the wall. "It's too clean." That earned another quiet laugh. "It usually is." He did not move. The road between them seemed oddly significant in that moment, short in distance and vast in meaning. Behind him lay the life he knew. Hard ground, sharper people, hunger, survival, streets that never asked him to become anything except dangerous. Ahead stood walls built by structure, law, strength refined into order. He did not understand such a place. He distrusted it instinctively. Unohana waited. She did not call him weak for stopping. She did not order him forward. She simply stood there, patient in a way no one in Rukungai had ever been with him. Finally, he asked, "Why bring me here?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Because this is where you can grow." He looked toward the white walls again. "And if I don't want to?" For the first time since he had met her, Unohana's eyes sharpened in a way that reminded him exactly what she truly was. "Then you may turn around," she said softly, "and go back, no anger, no threat, just truth." He stared at her. The option unsettled him more than being forced would have. He had expected pressure, manipulation, a trap hidden behind kindness. Rukungai taught that every invitation carried a hook, but she offered him an actual choice, and he did not know what to do with that immediately. Behind him was survival. Ahead was her. That was the simplest version of it, and perhaps the most honest. He hated how quickly the decision made itself. He stepped forward. Unohana's eyes warmed, though her smile remained small. "Good!" He almost bristled at that, but the response died before it reached his mouth. Some part of him had wanted her approval. The realization irritated him enough to make him walk past her a little too quickly. She merely turned and resumed leading the way. The road descended toward the gates. By the time they reached them, the boy's silence had grown heavier, not from fear exactly, but from vigilance so intense it bordered on strain. The gates of Sarite towered overhead, broad and severe, framed by guards whose spiritual pressure alone marked them as stronger than many fighters in the districts he had left behind. Their hands rested on weapons, their eyes sharpened immediately at the sight of Unohana and the ragged, blood-marked boy walking behind her. The boy felt all of it, the scrutiny, the caution, the readiness. He met it with the only response he possessed. He watched back. One of the guards stepped forward, bowed to Unohana, then let his gaze slide toward the boy. "Captain Unohana," so that was it, Captain. The word settled into place beside her name, not fully understood but useful. Important enough that armed men with steady hands bowed before it. She inclined her head slightly. "Open the gate." The guard hesitated, just for a breath. It was small enough that most would have missed it. The boy did not. The guard looked at him again, not with contempt, with concern. "Captain, this one?" Unohana's voice remained calm. "Yes," no explanation followed. The guard stepped back immediately. The gates opened. The sound rolled through the air like distant thunder. The boy's body went tight. Inside. He was expected to walk inside that place. Unohana stepped through first. He followed. The instant he crossed the threshold, the pressure shifted. The outer world fell away behind him, and Sarite opened in measured lines of stone roads, tall roofs, ordered buildings, uniforms, banners, clean water channels, and people who moved with purpose rather than mere need. It was not simply a place. It was a different logic made physical. His first instinct was that he did not belong in it. His second was more troubling. He wanted to see how far it would bend before it broke. He kept that thought to himself. But Sarite noticed him. He felt it almost at once. Not everyone openly. Some glanced and then looked away too quickly. Others stared longer, curiosity overcoming manners. A few slowed their pace entirely, taking in the bloodstains on his clothes, the old scars across his hands and wrists, the chipped sword, the way he walked behind a captain without bowing his head or lowering his eyes. Their looks meant nothing to him, but their spiritual pressure did. Strong, not strong enough. Some disciplined, some unstable beneath the calm, some sharpened into killing tools, some softened by healing or duty or long peace. He understood them best through that language. Unohana led him through one district and into another. White walls gave way to courtyards. Courtyards opened toward wide halls and training grounds. He saw swords and racks. He saw men and women moving through drills with a kind of formality that made him immediately aware of how rough his own style must look by comparison. He did not care. He had lived. If their clean technique could not do the same, then it was just decoration. The thought was still passing through him when they entered a broad training space lined with polished wood and open air. Several seated officers paused mid-practice. Their attention moved first to Unohana, then to the boy at her side. The atmosphere tightened. Unohana stopped walking at the center of the yard. "This will do." He looked around. "For what?" Her eyes met his. "For seeing what you do when you're not fighting scraps in the street." The words should have insulted him. Instead, they thrilled him. Around them, the officers shifted. Some stepped back. Others remained where they were, but their posture changed subtly, preparing for danger out of reflex more than direct command. Unohana turned toward them. "Leave us." The response was immediate. No one argued. Within moments, the training yard emptied, though he could still feel presences watching from just beyond the threshold, drawn by suspicion, curiosity, or simple self-preserving concern. He rolled his shoulders once, loosening tension from the road. Unohana drew her blade. The polished whisper of steel sliding free sent a chill through his spine, not of fear but anticipation. "Show me," she said. He did not need further invitation. Their swords met again, this time under a clean sky and on leveled ground instead of in a broken street between rotting buildings. The difference mattered more than he expected. No loose stones shifted underfoot. No narrow alley limited movement. No hidden drop-offs, mud, debris, or wall angles shaped the fight. There was only space, and in that space, everything became clearer. He saw immediately how much she had held back before. The realization was almost enough to make him laugh. Almost. She dismantled his first 3 attacks with insulting ease, turning them aside, guiding his blade offline and touching the flat of hers against his wrist before he could recover. Not cutting, correcting. The distinction stung. He came again faster. She moved less than half as much as he did and still arrived where she needed to be first. Again, again, again. Each exchange ended with some subtle proof of superiority. His balance slightly broken, his guard opened, his blade redirected, his centerline compromised. It infuriated him. It exhilarated him more. Unohana watched that shift happen in him and smiled. "Good," she said after knocking his sword wide for the 5th time. "Now you're paying attention." He attacked without answering. This time she gave ground. Only a little, but enough to feed the fire she had just lit. Their blades rang sharply across the yard. He fought with everything Rukungai had taught him. Directness, adaptability, instinct sharpened by necessity. She met it all with something maddeningly better. Not simply greater power, but knowledge. She knew where his rough habits came from almost before he fully committed to them. She could read the urgency in the way he moved, the survival-based economy that made him dangerous and limited in equal measure. After one especially brutal exchange, his blade skidded across hers and nearly left his grip entirely. He caught it before it dropped. She noticed. Her brows lifted. "That was quick. You were trying to take it, yes." He reset his stance. "You won't." The smile that touched her mouth then was smaller than before, more private. "We'll see." They fought until sweat ran down his back and his lungs burned. The cleaner ground gave him no excuses. The open space exposed every inefficiency in his movement. For the first time, he began to understand the difference between surviving a fight and mastering one. The gap between them was enormous. That should have broken him. Instead, it filled the hollow place in his chest with something fierce and bright. This was what she had meant. Growth. Not comfort, not shelter, pressure, unrelenting and purposeful. When at last Unohana stepped back and lowered her sword, he was still readying himself to go again. "That's enough," he frowned. "I'm not done, I know." She sheathed her blade. "That is why we are stopping." He stared at her, breathing hard. The answer made no sense. She walked toward him, calm now. The dangerous exhilaration of battle folded neatly back into composure. "You would keep going until your body failed," she said. Then you would learn nothing tomorrow. He hated that she was probably right. Probably. I can still move? I can see that. She stopped just in front of him. Up close, without the blur of combat, he became aware again of how calm her face was even after a fight like that. Not untouched. Never untouched. There was life in her now, brightness in her gaze the road had not shown as clearly. She was pleased. By him. The realization hit harder than it should have. You're weak in the open, she said. He bristled instantly. Her eyes softened with amusement. Compared to what you could become, she added. Not compared to the trash you left behind. The insult to his old district did not bother him as much as the possibility hidden inside the rest of the sentence. Could become. He looked away before he could do something foolish like ask too quickly. Unohana turned and began walking toward the covered edge of a yard. He followed automatically. She stopped beside a low wooden step and sat with the ease of someone entirely untroubled by the silence stretching between them. After a second's hesitation, he remained standing. She glanced up at him. You can sit. He stayed where he was. I'm fine, as you like. A servant arrived some minutes later carrying a tray. The boy's body tensed on instinct at the approach, but the servant kept eyes low, movements formal, and left without once trying to touch him. Bowls of water and simple food remained on the tray between them. He stared. Unohana lifted one bowl and drank. Only then did he move. He crouched rather than sat, taking the food with a caution so ingrained he no longer noticed it. He ate quickly at first, then slower when he realized no one was coming to take it. The water was clean, colder than he expected. The food simple and better than most things he had ever swallowed in Rukongai. When he finished, he became aware of Unohana watching him. Not judging, just observing. You were hungry? He set the empty bowl down. I'm usually hungry? The answer slipped out before he could decide whether to offer it. For a moment, something unreadable passed over her face. Then she nodded once. That will change too. He wanted to ask how many things she expected to change about him. He did not. Instead, he asked, why me? This time the question mattered differently than it had on the road. Not why bring me here. Why notice me at all? Unohana looked out across the training yard where the evening light had begun to turn the polished wood amber. Because you cut me. He frowned slightly. Only once. Yes, she said softly. That was enough. He studied her profile, the line of her cheek, the stillness in her shoulders, the hidden edge that never truly left her, no matter how calm she appeared. There was loneliness in her too, he realized suddenly. Not the same as his, not raw or desperate or shaped by abandonment. Hers felt older, sharper, a loneliness born not from being unwanted, but from never finding anyone who lasted. The thought came and settled before he had the words to explain it. Unohana turned her head just enough to catch him looking. What is it? He hesitated. Then, because he had never been practiced at lying for comfort, he said, You looked disappointed before. She blinked once. Before? In the street. Every time I didn't die right away, you looked less disappointed. Silence. Then that soft laugh again. Quieter now. You see more than you should. He accepted that without comment. After a moment, she said, Yes. The simple admission altered the air between them. For a long time, she continued, No one interesting survived long enough. He understood. More than he wanted to. The emptiness inside his chest stirred an answer, recognizing itself in a shape older and more dangerous than his own. He looked down at his hands. Scarred. Dirty still despite the cleaner place. Young, though less young than they had any right to be. If I get stronger, he said slowly, you'll keep fighting me. Unohana's answer came with no trace of irony. Yes. Something unclenched in him. He hated how much relief lived in that feeling. Night had fully settled by the time she rose and led him deeper into the division grounds. He passed rooms prepared for healing, halls lined with order, people who bowed to her and pretended not to stare at him. She showed him a small room, simple but clean, with a futon laid out and folded clothes set neatly nearby. He stood in the doorway and looked inside as though at a trap. She watched his expression and almost smiled. No one will come in unless I allow it. That mattered more than the bed or the walls or the impossible cleanliness. He nodded once. Unohana turned to leave, then paused. When the sun rises, she said, training begins again. His answer came instantly. Good. This time she did smile, just a little. When she left, he stood alone in the room for a long while. The quiet pressed strangely around him. No distant shouting, No nearby argument. No scrape of footsteps that might become an attack. No need to sleep with one eye open and a weapon in hand. He disliked how unnatural that felt. He disliked, too, the small dangerous part of him that wanted to become used to it. Eventually he set his sword within reach and lay down. The futon was softer than the ground, softer than any place he had slept in years. His body resisted it at first, unable to believe comfort came without cost. Muscles stayed tight. Breathing remained shallow. Instinct waited for interruption. None came. Outside, the division settled into night. Elsewhere within Serite, rumors were already beginning to move. Of Captain Unohana returning from the outer districts with a nameless savage at her heels, of blood on her shoulder, of a boy whose eyes looked too old and whose presence felt wrong for someone so young. Some spoke with amusement, some with skepticism, some with unease. Inside the small room, the boy knew nothing of that. He stared into darkness and listened to a silence he did not yet trust. And somewhere beyond walls and corridors, deeper within the same night, Unohana stood alone beneath the open sky with her hand resting lightly against the place on her shoulder where his blade had cut her. The wound was shallow. The memory was not. Her eyes lifted toward the moon. For the first time in longer than she cared to admit, anticipation curled through her not as distant hope, but as something real and immediate. The nameless boy from Rukungai had followed her through the gates of Serite. He had survived the first lesson. He had watched her with instinctive suspicion and answered her strength without flinching. And most importantly, he had looked less lonely after she promised to fight him again. That, more than the cut, more than the talent, more than the raw animal grace sharpened by survival, told her everything she needed to know. He was like her. Not yet in strength. Not yet in understanding, but in hunger. In that quiet, terrible desire for a battle that did not end too soon. Her fingers slipped from the wound on her shoulder. A small smile curved her mouth. At last she murmured into the night. Back in his room, the boy drifted toward sleep with his sword at hand and a thought repeating itself in the dark. Tomorrow. Not survive tomorrow. Not endure it. Not get through it tomorrow. Because for the first time in his life, tomorrow held something better than more of the same. It held her blade. And somewhere in the narrow space between exhaustion and sleep, the boy without a name smiled faintly in the dark, without knowing he had done it. Bleach, Crimson Kenpachi. Chapter 3. Blood Lessons. Morning in Serite did not arrive like morning in Rukungai. There was no slow suspicion to it, no wary stirring of bodies that had slept lightly and expected the day to ask too much. No streets already seated with tension before the sun had fully risen. Morning here came with order, bells in the distance, footsteps set to routine, doors sliding open in quiet sequence, water running clean through channels cut into stone. Voices kept low, disciplined, already aware of where they belonged. The nameless boy woke before any of it reached its full shape, his eyes open to a ceiling that still felt wrong. Too clean, too whole. He lay still for a few seconds with one hand already near the sword at his side, his body waiting for whatever threat had dragged him from sleep. When none came, the old instinct did not fully relax. It never fully relaxed, but it loosened enough for him to sit up. Light filtered through the frame of the window in pale gold bands. Dust did not dance in it here the way it had in broken Rukungai rooms. Even the air looked cleaner. He hated how much he noticed that. He rose, crossed the room, and paused beside the folded clothes left for him. They were plain by Serite standards, but to him they looked like garments meant for someone else's life. He touched the fabric once, suspiciously, then dressed because he saw no reason not to. The fit was close enough. The cloth did not pull awkwardly across his shoulders or wrists. Another small wrongness. Whoever had arranged it had guessed his size with irritating accuracy. His sword remained the same. Old, worn, honest. He took it with him. Outside, the division grounds were already awake. Members of the 4th Division moved through morning duties with practiced ease. Some carried supplies. Some crossed the courtyards in pairs, speaking quietly. A few, upon seeing him emerge, faltered almost imperceptibly before continuing on. The hesitation amused him more than it should have. They were afraid of him. Not openly. Not like the people of Rukungai who feared with their whole bodies and made no effort to hide it. This was a cleaner fear. Better contained. Measured through discipline. Still fear. He understood that language well enough. He had only taken a few steps into the courtyard when he felt her. Unohana, not through sound, through pressure. Even restrained, her presence carried its own shape in the air. Cool, steady, vast in a way that made the space around her seem less like ordinary ground and more like the edge of deep water. He turned. She stood on the far side of the courtyard beneath a long angle of morning light, white Captain's hari resting cleanly over darker layers, dark hair trailing down her back, expression composed in that same gentle way that now no longer fooled him in the slightest. Good, she said when she saw him already up. You're awake? He looked at her for a second, then at the empty air around her, then back. You were waiting. The faintest smile touched her mouth. Yes, why? Because I was curious whether you would run. That made him frown. He almost answered immediately, almost said I told you I was staying, but the words caught. It bothered him that she had even considered the possibility. More than that, it bothered him that some part of him understood why she had. Instead he said, I wouldn't leave before another fight. Her smile widened just enough to show she liked the answer. I thought that might be the case. She turned and began walking toward the training grounds without needing to tell him to follow. He did. The path led them through a wider section of the division than he had seen the night before. Morning practice had already begun in neighboring courtyards. He saw healers carrying equipment, officers sparring with wooden swords, attendants rolling fresh bandages and cloth with mechanical precision. Everywhere he looked, things existed in systems. Work connected to other work. People moved according to expectations they all seemed to understand. It irritated him in the abstract. It also made him more alert. Because systems meant rules, and rules usually meant cages. He was still thinking that when Unohana led him into an enclosed training ground broader than the one they had used the previous evening. This one had weapon racks along the walls, polished wood underfoot near the edges, and worn stone in the center where countless fights had already taken place. The open sky above left nowhere for attention to hide. She stepped to the center and turned to face him. Today, she said, you begin learning how to fight. He stared at her. I already know how. No, she said, still calm. You know how to survive. The answer landed like a slap. His shoulders tightened immediately. Unohana saw it and did not soften the statement. You attack with good instincts, you adapt quickly, you read danger well, but everything you do is built around desperation. You fight as if every exchange must end immediately. That's how you stay alive. In Rukungai, yes. Her eyes sharpened. Here, it will limit you. His grip settled tighter around the hilt of his sword. He did not like being told that what had kept him alive all this time was insufficient. He disliked even more that she was probably right. Unohana walked toward the nearest rack and lifted a wooden practice sword from it. She turned it once in her hand, measuring its balance, then tossed another toward him. He caught it out of reflex and almost dropped it from surprise. The wood felt wrong. Too light in some ways, too blunt in others. A weapon stripped of finality. He looked down at it, then at her. No, use it, no. Her expression did not change. Why? He held up the wooden blade slightly. It can't kill anyone. That is the point. He frowned harder. Then it's not useful. Unohana's gaze rested on him for a long moment. If the only thing making your movement sharp is the intention to kill, then you are still cruder than I hoped. The words struck deeper than they should have, because buried inside the irritation was something else. Challenge. He did not notice himself stepping farther into the center of the yard until he was already doing it. Unohana noticed. Of course she did. Good, she said again, the word warm and infuriating both. Now, show me your stance. He raised the wooden sword in one hand and squared himself in the way that felt natural. Her silence stretched. Then, that is terrible. His eyes narrowed. It worked on frightened men in alleys. She stepped forward, wooden sword lowered at her side. Stand properly? I am standing properly. Unohana moved without warning. The wooden blade cracked against his wrist hard enough to sting. He jerked back on instinct. That, she said mildly, is what happens when you insist on being stubborn? His grip shifted. He barely kept hold of the weapon. Anger rose fast and bright. He liked that even less than he liked the pain, because she had done it on purpose, not simply to hit him, but to pull the reaction out where she could see it. Again, she said. He attacked. Not because she ordered it, because he wanted to hit her. The wooden sword cut downward toward her shoulder. She moved one step to the side and lifted her blade just enough to redirect his strike past her. Before he recovered, she tapped the back of his knee. Not hard, hard enough. He dropped a fraction. Your feet, she said. He rose instantly and came again, this time faster, leading with a thrust. She turned her wrist, guiding the strike offline, then struck the center of his chest with the flat of her wooden blade. He stumbled backward, breath catching. Your center? He attacked without waiting. She punished that too. Again, again, again. Each failure arrived not as humiliation, but as a precise correction delivered through force. When his elbows flared too wide, the wooden blade cracked against one and folded his guard inward. When his shoulders lifted before a committed strike, she stepped inside and struck him across the ribs before he could complete it. When he relied too heavily on his speed, she cut off his angle and made him collide with his own momentum. The stinging pain began to gather in a map across his arms, shoulders, legs, and side. He did not stop. The longer it went on, the less the frustration felt like ordinary anger. It became fuel. Sharp, clean. Every correction she forced into him gave shape to the next movement, and the next after that. He found himself thinking less about landing a hit and more about understanding why he had missed. That realization came slowly enough that it startled him when he noticed it. Unohana saw the shift happen, and for the first time that morning, her eyes warmed with unmistakable approval. "There," she said as he reset his stance yet again. "Now you're learning." Sweat had begun to gather along his back and temple. His forearms ached from repeated impacts. The hand holding the practice sword had gone slightly numb and was coming back in painful increments. He adjusted his feet. She noticed immediately. A tiny change. Barely anything. But this time, when he attacked, his weight landed more cleanly beneath him. His shoulders remained lower. The strike still failed. She still turned it aside. But when she moved to punish the opening, he recovered half a beat faster than before. Her blade stopped just short of his throat. Silence. Unohana lowered the weapon slowly. Better. That one word did something unhelpful to the inside of his chest. He disliked it so intensely that he attacked again, almost at once. This time she laughed under her breath and met him with another merciless exchange. Morning slid into noon through repetition. Wood struck wood. Wood struck flesh. Stone felt every correction through the soles of his feet. His body learned because it was being forced to, and because some part of him, some dangerous, greedy part, had begun to love the process. Not the pain, not exactly. The clarity. In Rukungai, most fights had ended in chaos. Here, under her eye, every mistake became visible. Every improvement mattered. Every movement had a shape he could either sharpen or lose. At one point, after he overcommitted to a right side cut and nearly exposed his entire flank, Unohana stepped behind him so cleanly he did not understand where she had gone, until he felt the wooden sword settle lightly between his shoulder blades. "If this were steel," she said quietly near his ear, "you would already be dead." He froze. Not from fear. From awareness. She was close enough that he could feel the calm steadiness of her breathing. Close enough to sense the enormous power held so perfectly in check beneath her gentle tone. Close enough that if she had wanted, he truly would have died without ever seeing the final strike. He turned too quickly out of the position, wooden blade already rising. She was gone by the time he completed the motion, across from him again, waiting. "You rely too much on the eyes," she said. He said nothing, because she was right. He had fought in chaos for years, but most of that chaos had still belonged to a simpler scale. This, her, required something else. They continued. By the time the sun stood high overhead, the yard had become a world made of three things: movement, impact, and breath. He noticed observers eventually. Not because they made noise, because their attention gathered at the edges of the training ground like pressure against skin. Several division members had found reasons to be nearby. A pair of seated officers stood just outside the open threshold pretending, badly, to discuss something technical while staring every time they thought Unohana was not looking. Two healers slowed near the walkway with folded linens in their arms, only to stop entirely when a sharper exchange made them flinch in unison. The boy ignored them. Unohana did not. Without turning her head, she said, "If you wish to watch, do so quietly." The watchers straightened as if struck. No one retreated. They simply became still. The boy filed that away. People here obeyed her in ways deeper than fear alone. That was useful to know. Another exchange. Another correction. Another moment where she punished him for lifting his chin before a committed thrust. Then, finally, she stepped back and raised one hand. "That's enough." He was breathing harder now, chest rising and falling with more visible effort than he liked. His shoulders hurt. One thigh ached sharply where she had struck it 3 times for the same mistake until he stopped making it. Sweat clung at his throat and temple. The practice sword felt heavier than when the morning began, but he could still stand, so he frowned. "I can keep going." "Yes," she said. "And you would begin repeating your weaker habits, because fatigue has started pulling you toward instinct instead of learning." He almost argued. Then he thought about the last few exchanges and realized she had caught him reverting twice already. Once into a street-born rush meant to end things quickly. Once into a low defensive crouch that had value in an alley and much less on open ground. The realization annoyed him into silence. Unohana rested the practice sword across one shoulder. Sit. It was not an order spoken loudly. That made it somehow harder to resist. He sat on the stone step bordering the courtyard, practice sword laid across his knees. Unohana took the place beside him with a serenity that made it seem as if she had not just spent hours dismantling his body and habits one controlled strike at a time. The servants brought water first. This time he took it without pretending not to want it. Unohana watched him drink and said, "You recover quickly?" He lowered the cup. "I have to, in Rukongai." He looked at her sidelong. "You say that like I'm not from there anymore." A flicker passed through her expression. Not amusement this time. Thought. "You are from there," she said, "but you do not have to remain shaped only by it." He stared at the yard ahead of them. Bright stone, open sky. Observers pretending not to observe. "What if I like how it shaped me?" Unohana folded her hands loosely in her lap. "Then keep what is worth keeping." He looked at her fully now. "And the rest?" Her eyes met his. "Let it die." The answer slid into him with quiet force, because that he understood. Not refinement for refinement's sake. Not politeness. Not obedience. Cut away what weakens. Keep what survives. For a strange moment, the entire place made more sense. After a while, she asked, "Do you know why the wooden sword matters?" He looked down at the weapon in his lap. "No, because steel lies to many people." That pulled his attention back to her. She continued in the same calm voice. "When a blade can kill, weak fighters rely on fear, on ending things before they need to understand them, on convincing themselves that aggression is mastery. Wood removes that illusion. It reveals structure, timing, distance, control." She glanced at him. "It reveals what remains when killing is not enough." He turned the practice sword once in his hands. He did not like how much sense that made now. Unohana rose. "We continue after you eat." He looked up immediately. "More?" A small smile appeared. "Yes. Did you think one morning would be enough?" No. He had not. But hearing her say there would be more of this, more pressure, more correction, more chances to reach towards something larger than simple survival, struck that hollow place in his chest again, this time so cleanly he almost let it show. "Almost." He only said, "Good." The smile deepened by the smallest margin. They ate in a shaded corridor beside the courtyard. Simple food again. Better than he wanted to admit mattered. He noticed, this time, that others kept their distance, not because Unohana demanded it aloud, but because some silent understanding told them this space was hers to shape. The boy ate quickly anyway. Old habits did not vanish because there was no one immediately trying to take the bowl. Unohana said nothing about that. When training resumed, it changed. Morning had been structure, correction. Afternoon became pressure. She returned his real sword to him and drew her own. The shift in his body happened instantly, old instincts waking at once under the sight of living steel. Unohana noticed and said, "Good. Now show me what remains when you're holding something that matters." He attacked harder than before. Not sloppier, harder. The wooden sword had exposed, his own blade now tried to integrate. His feet set differently, his shoulders remained lower. His eyes tracked not just her weapon, but her hips, her stance, the tiny signs before motion began. He still missed, still failed, still found her blade turning his aside and punishing what remained open. But now the failures lived in narrower spaces. At one point he committed to a midline cut, expecting her to step away and counter. Instead she stepped in. Their blades locked close between them, steel grinding, faces nearer than they had been since the street in Rukongai. "Better," she said softly. Then she broke his guard and nearly sent the sword from his hand. He snarled under his breath, caught the slipping hilt, and came back low. That too pleased her. Hours later, when the sky had begun its slow descent toward evening, and the shadows across the division lengthened into cooler lines, he finally landed something that was not a cut, not even truly a threat, but enough to matter. He forced her to move sooner than she intended. He saw it, a tiny adjustment. No one else watching would have marked it. He did. The moment after he recognized it, his chest lit with savage satisfaction. Unohana saw that too. Her expression changed, not into surprise, but into something richer. Pride. dangerous, impossible pride. There, she said quietly. That is the difference. He stood breathing hard, sword lowered a fraction. What difference? She walked toward him, sheathing her blade as she came. The difference between flailing in desperation and forcing a true fighter to acknowledge you. The words hit with enough force to silence him completely. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he had to tilt his head slightly to keep meeting her gaze. You are still rough, she said. Still too eager to end things quickly. Still ruled by habits born from survival. The familiar irritation started to rise. Then she added, but now I can see the shape of what you'll become. The irritation vanished under something hotter and stranger. He did not know what expression crossed his face, only that Unohana's eyes softened when she saw it. And because he did not know what to do with that softness, he looked away first. Evening settled over Sarite by the time she dismissed him. He expected to be sent back to the room and left alone with soreness, food, and too much thinking. Instead, when he reached the doorway of the small room that had become his for now, he found someone already there, a 4th Division attendant, young, nervous, holding a wrapped bundle in both hands as if it might explode if he held it wrong. The boy's body tensed instantly. The attendant nearly dropped the bundle. See, Captain Unohana requested that this be delivered. The boy The attendant swallowed. It's stared. The attendant swallowed. It's for the bruising, silence. The boy looked at the bundle, then at the man, then back again. He had been patched before, of course, in Rukungai, when it was necessary and there was no better option. But never like this. Never preemptively. Never because someone had simply decided his injuries mattered enough to address. He took the bundle. The attendant looked relieved enough to collapse. There are instructions inside, he blurted, then bowed clumsily and retreated before the boy could answer. The room felt unusually quiet after that. He unwrapped the cloth with visible suspicion and found salve, bandages, and a note in a hand he did not yet recognize.
You will heal faster if you stop pretending pain is unimportant.
Use it. He stared at the note for a long time. Then, despite himself, a short breath escaped him that might have been a laugh if it had known how. He used the salve. The bruises along his arms and side throbbed under his fingers. The sting in his wrist had deepened into a dull ache. The mark at the back of his knee from that morning pulsed unpleasantly every time he bent it. He treated them all in silence. By the time he finished, the room had darkened. Night had returned to Sarite. Through the window he could see lantern light glowing along distant walkways, hear the softened rhythm of night patrols and late movement through the division. He sat on the floor rather than the futon at first, sword across his knees, and let the day replay itself, her voice correcting him, her blade punishing him. The strange thrill of being seen correctly and pushed anyway. The moment he had forced her to adjust, the moment she said she could see what he would become. That last one stayed longest. He should have slept. Instead, he rose again, crossed the room, and slid the door open just enough to step back out into the corridor. The night air met him cool and clean. He did not have a reason to be outside. That irritated him. Still, he walked. The division grounds had quieted, but not emptied. A few lanterns still burned beside the training courtyards. Somewhere far off, someone laughed softly, then hushed themselves. A pair of healers crossed a distant walkway with folded cloths and did a poor job of pretending they had not seen him. He ignored them. Almost without deciding to, he made his way back toward the training grounds. The yard lay mostly dark now, moonlight silvering the stone, lantern glow catching the polished edge of weapon racks. He stepped into the center and stood there alone. Then he raised the practice sword he had carried with him. Would hum through the air, again, again, again. He repeated the movement Unohana had corrected first, then the adjustment to his feet, then the lowered shoulder, then the change in how he recovered after overextending. Not because she had ordered it. Because for the first time, a path had appeared in front of him that did not vanish as soon as he reached for it. He practiced until he heard the soft step of another presence at the edge of the yard. He turned. Unohana stood beneath the lantern light, white Hari pale in the dark, watching him with a look so unreadable he almost tensed. How long have you been there? Long enough? He lowered the wooden sword a little. You're not sleeping. Neither are you? The answer came before he could stop it. A small smile touched her mouth. Well done. You've noticed I'm not an ordinary captain. He looked at her for a second. You're not ordinary anything? That made her laugh, quiet and genuine. The sound settled strangely and warmly through the night. She stepped into the yard. Moonlight touched her hair and the line of her cheek. The cut he had made on her shoulder in Rukungai had long since been treated, but he found his eyes drawn there anyway, to the place where his blade had once reached her and changed both their paths. You came back to practice, she said. Yes, why? He held the wooden sword loosely at his side. Because I want tomorrow to matter. Because when you said better, I wanted to hear it again. Because I didn't know a day could feel like this. He had none of those words. So he answered the simplest way he knew. I want to hit you. Unohana's eyes gleamed. Good, she said softly. Then we'll continue in the morning. She should have turned then, left him with that promise. Instead, she remained there, standing across from him in the moonlit yard, and something gentler entered the silence between them. You learn quickly, she said after a moment. He looked away. I have to... No, her voice, though quiet, stopped him from dismissing it. You choose to... The difference between those two things hung in the air. He did not know what to do with it. Unohana seemed to understand that. She did not press further. She only looked at the practiced sword in his hand, then at him. You are allowed to want something other than survival now. The words struck deeper than the training had. His grip tightened on the wood. Allowed. As if permission mattered. As if there existed a world where wanting more did not immediately invite punishment. He did not answer. He could not. Perhaps because she saw that too, Unohana inclined her head slightly and turned to go. At the edge of the yard, she paused. When the sun rises, she said without looking back, show me what changed. Then she left him to the moonlight and the empty yard and the violence her kindness did to the hard shape of his old life. He stood there for a long time after she was gone. The practiced sword remained in his hand. The night remained still. Inside him, something had begun to shift. Not the dangerous instinct that had kept him alive, not the sharpness Rukungai had forged, but the direction of it, the point of it. Until now, he had sharpened himself because the world would kill him if he did not. Now, for the first time, he wanted to sharpen himself because someone existed who made growth feel more urgent than fear. That thought should have frightened him more than it did. Eventually, he resumed practice. The wooden blade cut through moonlit air in measured arcs while Sirite slept around him. Each movement carried the memory of her corrections. Each repetition drew the lessons deeper into bone and muscle. Somewhere between the 10th and 100th strike, the night ceased feeling strange. Not familiar, not yet, but possible. And inside the quiet room that waited for him when he finally returned, sleep did not feel like surrender. It felt like an interval. Because morning would come, and when it did, she would be waiting. He understood very little of what was happening to him. He understood only this. He no longer woke looking for the next danger. He woke looking for her blade. Bleach, Crimson Kenpachi. Chapter 4, the first real lesson. Before dawn, Serete belonged to footsteps. Not the careless footsteps of drunks stumbling home through broken streets. Not the hard, suspicious tread of men trying to sound more dangerous than they were. These steps were measured, quiet, purposeful. They crossed polished corridors and cold stone walkways with the rhythm of people whose lives were built on structure. Kurgain, though he did not yet bear that name, heard them long before the sun rose. He was already awake. He had slept more deeply than he meant to, which annoyed him the moment he realized it. The room had been too still, the bed too soft, the walls too secure. Somewhere in the night, without permission, his body had accepted safety long enough to truly rest. He sat up sharply, irritated at himself before his eyes were fully open. The sword lay where he had left it. The room remained untouched. No one had entered. No one had tried. That should have eased something in him. Instead, it sharpened the strange new feeling that had been following him since he entered Sarite. Expectation. He rose, dressed, and took up his blade. When he slid the door open, cool morning air met him first, clean and thin, touched with the scent of wet stone and distant cedar. The sky was still dark at the edges, washed in deep blue with only the faintest gray gathering low along the horizon. Lanterns glowed in sheltered corners. Water moved through narrow channels with a soft, constant sound. And beneath it all, her presence. He felt it at once, not close enough to touch, not yet, but there, waiting. He should have found that unsettling. Instead, something in his chest tightened with a sharp, immediate focus that felt almost like hunger. He moved through the division grounds without hesitation, passing quiet attendants and early rising healers who noticed him and pretended not to. Their restraint still amused him. In Rukongai, curiosity was blunt. Here it came dressed in discipline, all lowered eyes and carefully neutral expressions that failed completely to hide the flickers of attention. He ignored all of them. The training ground lay open beneath the paling sky. Unohana stood at its center. She had not drawn her sword yet. Her hands rested loosely inside her sleeves, white Hari pale against the dim morning light, long dark hair falling still around her shoulders. She looked almost gentle standing there alone in the blue-gray dawn. Almost. He knew better now. Her head turned slightly as he approached. "You're earlier. So are you—" A faint smile touched her mouth. "Yes." He stopped several paces away, sword at his side, eyes on her. For a moment, neither moved. The stillness between them did not feel empty anymore. It felt full of memory, of anticipation, of the promise of collision. The first morning he had stepped into this place, he had been tense with suspicion. Now tension remained, but it had changed shape. It pointed forward instead of outward. Unohana saw it immediately. "You practiced?" It was not a question. He glanced once toward the practice sword rack, then back at her. "Yes. How long?" He shrugged slightly. "Until I was tired. That narrows it down very little." He almost answered with something sharper, but the corner of her mouth lifted again, and he caught the dry amusement in her voice. It softened the instinctive edge of his reply before it fully formed, long enough to stop making the first few mistakes. Only the first few. Yes, the smile deepened just enough to matter. Good. That one word struck him with the same irritating satisfaction as yesterday. He hated that. He wanted more of it anyway. Unohana stepped toward the rack and this time did not reach for a wooden sword. Instead, she drew her blade. The steel whispered free into the cold morning air. The sound ran through him cleanly. "Today," she said, "you learn what happens when you stop treating every fight as a street brawl." His grip tightened around his own weapon. "It's still a fight." "Yes." Her eyes lifted to his. "But not every fight should look the same." She raised her sword slightly. "Come." He moved instantly. The first clash rang out across the yard, sharp enough to disturb birds from the nearby roofs. He attacked harder than the day before, not with the wild desperation of Rukongai, but with the intention he had built in the moonlit hours after training ended. His feet landed cleaner beneath him. His shoulders remained lower. He did not overreach with the first strike. He did not expose his centerline immediately after committing. Unohana met the attack and turned it aside, but not as easily. He saw it. Just a fraction of a difference. Enough. He pivoted and came again, blade flashing toward her left shoulder before cutting lower at the last instant. The shift was quick, tighter than it had been in prior bouts, and for the first time her response required a visible adjustment. Not a stumble. Not a loss. An adjustment. The recognition flashed through him like heat. Unohana's eyes sharpened with approval. "Yes," she said softly as their blades scraped apart. "Again." He gave her no time to settle. What followed did not resemble the first day's systematic dismantling. That had been instruction through correction. This became something closer to true training. Pressure met by pressure, improvement forcing new responses from both sides. Unohana remained in complete control of the larger shape of the fight, but now he could feel the places where his choices mattered. It changed everything. His body moved faster. His attention deepened. He began to read not just what she did, but what she did not do. The options she abandoned. The angles she chose not to take because he had closed them sooner. The moments where she redirected him not because she had to, but because she was testing whether he would understand why. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he failed badly enough that the answer came in the form of her blade striking his wrist, shoulder, or side with humiliating precision. One exchange drove that lesson deeper than the others. He pressed her with a rapid series of cuts, a high angle followed by a tight horizontal slash, and then a sudden forward step meant to collapse the space between them. The first two were deliberate. The third was instinct, a Rukongai habit reasserting itself, the old belief that closeness and pressure could crush a better fighter's rhythm before it fully formed. Unohana vanished from his direct line of sight. For one thin, terrifying instant, he lost her. Then cold steel touched the back of his neck. He froze, not because she had ordered him to, because his body knew. Dead. The realization arrived so cleanly it stole his breath. Unohana's voice came from behind him, calm as still water. There, he did not move. "Do you feel it?" "Yes." "What?" He swallowed once only. "I chased the opening." "No." The blade remained where it was. "You chased the end of the fight." Silence. The truth of it sank in with brutal efficiency. Rukongai had taught him to seek finishes wherever they flickered, to collapse distance when the other person gave even the smallest weakness. Against lesser opponents, that instinct had served him. Against her, it had become a leash she could pull whenever she pleased. Unohana withdrew the blade. He turned immediately, not striking, just looking at her. Her expression remained composed, but there was no softness in the lesson. "You are always trying to end things," she said. You lunge toward conclusions. That is the habit of someone who lived too long among weak fighters in desperate situations. He frowned, breath still uneven. If I don't end it, I get hit. Her gaze did not waver. And if you commit to ending it too early against someone superior, you die. He said nothing. Because again, she was right. The knowledge irritated him so intensely he almost attacked just to drown it out. Unohana saw the shift in his expression and impossibly approved of that too. Good, she said. Be angry, but be precise with it. Then she stepped back, raised her sword again, and the lesson resumed. The sun had barely broken the horizon by then, light beginning to spill gold across the upper roofs of the division, but the training ground already felt hot with movement. Steel struck steel. Feet whispered over stone, each exchange built on the last. Each mistake exposed something, and each correction left something sharpened behind. Hours passed that way. The world narrowed into lines of force and intent. At first, he measured progress through obvious things, the number of times he could force her to adjust, the fraction of a second longer he could hold his ground, the rare moments when her counter arrived not instantly but after a real choice. But slowly his understanding shifted. Progress was not only in pressing harder, it was in seeing more, in recognizing when her wrists relaxed just before a redirection, in noticing how her footing changed when she intended to test rather than punish, in hearing, actually hearing, the difference between blades meeting on her terms and blades meeting on ground he had helped shape. That distinction began to matter more than pride. It frightened him how much that excited him. A little after sunrise, she called a halt. This time he did not argue immediately. He knew enough now to notice the tremor beginning deep in his forearms, the subtle dulling at the edges of his perception that meant fatigue had started pulling his instincts back toward old habits. Rukungai had taught him to ignore that feeling until the body failed. Unohana was teaching him to recognize it before it made him sloppy. She noticed that he noticed. You stopped yourself. He lowered his sword slightly. Yes, why? Because the next mistake would be one I already know. A small silence followed. Then, Unohana smiled. Not the dangerous smile of battle, not the calm one she wore before others. Something warmer. Exactly, the approval landed more quietly this time, and because of that it struck deeper. He turned away first, annoyed with himself for caring. Water arrived. Food followed. He ate seated at the edge of the yard while Unohana stood nearby speaking briefly with a 4th Division officer who had approached and bowed so low it looked painful. The officer's gaze flicked to him once, quickly, then away. He could feel the question in it even without hearing words. Who is he? Why is the captain spending her morning like this? Why does he stand so close to her without flinching? The nameless boy ignored the curiosity and drank deeply from the cup in his hands. The morning had left his body alive with ache. Not the blunt aftermath of a back alley beating, something cleaner. He could map the lessons through the soreness. Wrist, shoulder, thigh, ribs. The back of his neck still remembered the light touch of her blade. He found that memory most irritating of all. After the officer left, Unohana approached and took the place beside him on the stone edge of the yard. You're thinking too loudly. He looked at her sidelong. I'm not talking, no. Her gaze drifted toward the brightening sky over the courtyard. But you are thinking very hard about how you almost died. His hand tightened slightly around the cup. I did die. She inclined her head once. Yes, the blunt agreement startled him enough that he looked at her fully. Unohana's expression remained calm. You should keep that feeling. Why? Because it will help you separate fear from information. He frowned. She continued before he could respond. Most fighters confuse the two. They feel danger and become either reckless or timid. Both are failures of judgment. Fear is only useful if it tells you something true. He stared at her for a moment, then looked down at the water in his cup. What did it tell me? That you are still trying to force the shape of a fight before you understand it? Silence. Then he muttered, You always sound calm when you say things that are insulting. A laugh slipped out of her, before she seemed to decide whether to allow it. That is because they are not insults. He looked unconvinced. Unohana tilted her head slightly. If I wished to insult you, you would know. Something in the way she said it, light, almost playful, and yet carrying an absolutely effortless confidence, caught him unexpectedly off guard. Against his will, the corner of his mouth shifted. Not much, barely there. Unohana saw it immediately, her gaze sharpened. You smiled, he looked away at once. No, you did. I didn't. That only made her laugh again softly, and the sound spread through the quiet morning air in a way he was beginning to learn affected him too much. By midday, the training changed again. This time Unohana did not begin with combat. She had him stand in the center of the yard with his sword lowered. Do nothing, she said. He blinked. That's not training. Yes, it is. How? Stand still, he did, though the effort it took annoyed him more than if she had demanded another 100 strikes. Unohana circled him once. Then again. He tracked her with his eyes. Don't, he frowned. Why? Because your eyes are slow, that earned a sharper reaction than usual. He turned his head toward her. They're not slow, they are compared to instinct. She stopped in front of him. Stop relying on them. That made no sense. How else was he supposed to know where she was? As if hearing the thought, she said, You feel me already. Stop pretending you don't. Then she vanished. Not truly vanished. Moved. Fast enough that sight lost her. His body reacted before his mind did, shoulders tightening, weight shifting, breath catching. A light tap struck the back of his left shoulder. He twisted. Too late. Another tap landed against his right ribs, then his wrist, then the center of his spine. Each one a correction, each one proving the same thing. He could feel her, not clearly, not with control, but enough that if he stopped trying so hard to track her visually, something deeper began to answer. Her pressure changing, air moving. Instinct registering where danger would appear before sight caught up. It felt alien. It also felt true. By the time she let him move again, frustration and fascination had become impossible to separate. This is stupid, he muttered. No. Unohana walked back into view, entirely unruffled. This is necessary, he scowled. She ignored it. Again. Afternoon light turned warmer. Shadows lengthened. More people gathered at the edges of the grounds than before, though always under the guise of duty. The nameless boy no longer cared. Let them stare. Let them wonder why Captain Unohana had chosen a blood-marked stray from the outer districts and was now shaping him with the same careful brutality a master smith might use on flawed steel. He only cared that when she struck, he had begun to know, faintly, from where. He only cared that when he attacked, she no longer looked merely amused. She looked interested. Once, only once, in the late afternoon, he found an opening and used it correctly. No lunge, no desperate attempt to finish. He let the fight remain unfinished for the sake of a better position, guided her blade wider than she intended, and forced her to reset the line between them from a less dominant angle. Unohana stopped. He did too, immediately suspicious. The entire yard fell quiet. What? He asked. For a second she only looked at him. Then she said, very softly, there you are. The same words she had used in Rukungai. But now he understood them better. Not there is the beast. Not there is the child who survived. Something narrower. Deeper. There's the fighter you are beginning to become. The realization hit him harder than any strike that day. Heat moved through his chest so sharply he almost hated it. Unohana's eyes held his a moment longer before she sheathed her sword. That's enough. This time he did not protest. He was too tired, too aware, too full of the day's lessons. The attendants brought fresh water. The watchers began to disperse, murmuring to one another in low, controlled voices. Somewhere beyond the yard, bells sounded the transition into evening duties. Serite resumed its orderly breathing around them. The boy stood alone for a second in the center of the ground, sword hanging at his side, sweat cooling on his skin, body aching with the kind of fatigue that felt earned rather than merely endured. Unohana approached. You changed faster today, he looked at her. Because I know what to look for now. Her expression remained unreadable for a heartbeat. Then, that is part of it. The answer suggested there was more. He waited. Unohana stepped closer, close enough that he could smell clean steel and the faint trace of medicinal herbs that always seemed to cling to her sleeves. You changed faster, she said. Because you wanted to? He said nothing. Something in him resisted the wording. Not because it was untrue, because it was too true. Wanting had always been dangerous. In Rukungai, want too much and someone notices. Want openly and someone takes it. Want anything beyond survival and the world punishes you for arrogance. But here, he had wanted to improve, wanted to understand, wanted her to look at him the way she had when he finally got it right. And somehow that had made him stronger instead of weaker. The thought unsettled him deeply. Unohana seemed to sense the disturbance, and for once did not press on the bruise of it. Instead, she said, You did well. plainly, without softening it, without wrapping it in instruction. The directness struck him silent. He lowered his eyes first, not out of submission, just to escape the feeling of being too visible. Not enough. No, she agreed. Not yet. He looked back up. Unohana's gaze had gentled again, but enough for today. Evening settled over the division by the time he reached his room. His body protested each movement now, more honestly than it had the day before. He cleaned the sweat from his skin, treated the bruises that needed it, and ate the food left for him with less suspicion than before, though still too quickly. Afterward, he sat on the floor with his sword across his lap and watched the fading light at the window. He should have been asleep soon after. He knew that. He also knew, with a growing certainty he did not want to examine too closely, that he would return to the training ground once darkness deepened, because tomorrow existed now. Because she did. Because when her blade touched his throat or shoulder or ribs, it no longer felt like proof that he was weak. It felt like a road being carved forward. Night came. He went. The moon hung higher this time, cleaner and fuller above the white rooftops of Serete. Lanterns cast golden pools across the walkways. The training ground waited open and silvered when he stepped into it, and she was already there. Of course she was. Unohana stood near the center of the yard, hands hidden inside her sleeves, gaze turned upward briefly toward the moon before lowering to him as he approached. She did not look surprised. You came back, yes. Why? He almost answered the same way as before. Because I want to hit you. That was still true. But something about the quiet of the evening, the long, hard shape of the day behind him, and the way she stood there waiting as if his return had already been accounted for in the night itself, made a different answer rise. I didn't want today to end yet. The words left him before he could decide whether to keep them. Silence followed. Not empty silence. The kind that changes things. Unohana looked at him steadily, and for a moment all her usual masks seemed to still. No healer's softness, no captain's composure, no amused predator's smile. Just a woman hearing something honest. Then, very gently, she asked, "Why?" He should have looked away. He did not. Because you see me. Because I feel less alone when your blade is in front of mine. Because this is the first place I have ever wanted to become more than what survived. He had none of those words either. He never did. So he answered in the narrowest way he could without lying. Because I was still thinking about it. Unohana's gaze remained on him another breath longer than usual. Then a small smile returned to her mouth. "Good," she said quietly. "You should be." She stepped forward, lifted one of the wooden practice swords from the rack, and offered it to him. This time, he took it without arguing. The gesture itself seemed to please her. "Again?" he asked. Again. There was no full training that night, no long series of punishments and corrections. Instead, she adjusted his footing, moved his wrist by an inch, pressed 2 fingers against the line of his shoulder, and showed him where tension gathered before a strike. Demonstrated how his weight betrayed intention half a breath too early when he prepared to drive forward. The work was smaller, quieter, somehow more intimate for that. Each time she stepped near enough to correct him by touch, his body reacted before his mind did, never with fear, never with the alarm such closeness once would have caused, but with a sharp, disorienting awareness. He noticed it. He hated that he noticed it. Unohana noticed that too, but mercifully or perhaps strategically, she said nothing. At last, after the moon had climbed further and the night around them deepened into true stillness, she stepped back. "That's enough." He lowered the wooden sword. This time, he did not argue, because, for once, he did not want the moment spoiled by pushing against it. Unohana regarded him for a second. Then she asked, "Do you know what today's real lesson was?" He thought about it. There were too many possibilities. Don't chase endings. Feel more than you see. No fatigue before it makes you stupid. Wanting matters. He shook his head. Unohana's eyes softened. It was this. She stepped closer once more, moonlight tracing the line of her face, the white of her captain's hari luminous in the dark. You are no longer learning only because the world will kill you if you fail. A pause. You are learning because you have found something worth reaching for. The words struck with frightening accuracy. He went still. Unohana held his gaze. It changes the blade. The wind moved gently through the yard. Neither of them spoke. Somewhere far beyond the division walls, Soul Society carried on in its countless ordered motions. Inside the quiet square of moonlit stone where they stood, something subtler and far more dangerous took shape. Not romance, Not yet. Not anything soft enough to be named simply. A bond forged through recognition, through pressure, through the relief of finding, at last, another loneliness sharp enough to answer your own. The boy looked down first, not because he could not withstand her gaze, because for the first time in his life, he was not sure what all the things inside him were called. Unohana spared him from needing to know. "Rest," she said. He nodded. Then, after a moment, asked, "Will you still be here tomorrow?" The question slipped out in a tone too flat to hide what lived under it. Unohana heard it anyway. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Relief moved through him so quickly and so fiercely that he nearly resented it. He only nodded once more. Good. This time, when he turned to leave, he carried the practice sword back to the rack himself and set it carefully in place before taking up his real blade. Unohana watched the small act in silence. He felt her eyes on him all the way to the edge of the yard. When he finally glanced back, she was still standing there beneath the moon, white against the dark, calm and terrible, and somehow no longer distant in the way she had first seemed. He returned to his room with bruises deepening, muscles burning, and a strange steadiness in his chest. He slept faster that night, not because Sarite had become familiar, because tomorrow had. Bleach, Crimson Kenpachi, Chapter 5, The Shape of the Blade. By the 5th morning, the division had stopped pretending not to notice. They still lowered their eyes when Captain Unohana passed. They still moved with the same careful discipline through corridors, courtyards, and treatment halls. They still spoke softly, worked cleanly, bowed when expected, and kept the smooth order of the 4th Division intact. But now, whenever the nameless boy crossed the grounds behind her, conversations thinned, hands slowed, attention shifted. The reaction no longer came only from fear. It came from pattern. He had been there every morning. At dawn, at noon, at dusk, in the training yards, at the captain's side, bleeding, learning, returning. And each day he looked a little less like something dragged in from the outer districts and a little more like something being forged. That unsettled people. It should have unsettled him too. Instead, by the time the pale light of morning spread across the stone walkways of Sarite, he was already halfway to the yard, sword in hand, body sore and awake, mind fixed on only one thing. Her. Not in softness. Not yet. In the clean, hard way a blade fixes itself on the hand strong enough to wield it. He found Unohana waiting where she always seemed to be waiting now, as if she had long since rearranged her mornings around the certainty of his arrival. She stood in the center of the training ground, with her sleeves loose around her wrists and her expression composed, her long hair barely moving in the thin dawn wind. There was no visible sign that she had slept, no trace of fatigue, nothing to suggest she belonged to the same ordinary cycle as the rest of the division. She looked as she always did, calm, controlled, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with presence. He stopped a few paces away. "You're late," she said. He frowned instantly. "I'm not." Unohana lifted her gaze toward the paling sky, as if considering the argument, though the faint curve at the corner of her mouth told him she already knew the answer. "You are by 3 breaths. That's not late." "For you," she said, "it is." He stared at her. Then, despite himself, something in his chest shifted with a sharp, unwelcome warmth. She had noticed. Not in the broad way, she noticed every movement, every mistake, every tension in his shoulders and weight in his feet, in a narrower way. Enough to count breaths. He disliked how much that mattered, so he answered the only way he knew how. "Then I won't be late tomorrow." Unohana's smile deepened, small and private. "I know." That one landed harder than it should have. Before he could answer, she stepped toward the practice rack and chose neither wood nor steel. Instead, she took both. A wooden blade in one hand, real steel in the other. He watched, wary now for a new reason. "What are you doing?" "Teaching you the difference between fear and structure." He frowned. "That sounds annoying." "Yes," she said lightly. "It will be." She offered him a practice sword first. He took it. Then she raised the real blade slightly in her other hand, and saw the immediate shift in him. The minute tightening through the shoulders, the deeper focus in his eyes, the way his body responded to steel, even when it was not pointed directly at him. Unohana saw everything. "Good," she murmured. "Now don't let it control you," the morning began. Not with a clash, with stillness. "Stand there," she said, positioning him in the center of the yard. "And don't move until I tell you. That's stupid." "Yes." He held her gaze for a second, then did as she said. Unohana circled him once, her wooden blade lowered, her steel held loosely at her side. The two weapons altered the shape of the air around her. One represented instruction, the other consequence. He felt both. Your problem, she said, pacing around him, is that you react correctly to danger and incorrectly to possibility. He turned his head to follow her. Explain, danger makes you sharper. She moved behind him, and he felt, rather than saw, the shift in her position. Possibility makes you impatient. He said nothing. Because again, that sounded too close to true. Unohana continued. When you think something can end, you rush toward the ending. You become greedy. The word irritated him instantly. I don't get greedy. The wooden blade cracked lightly against the back of his calf. He twitched. You do, she said, particularly when you are excited. He almost turned on her for that alone. Excited. The word felt too revealing, too accurate, too close to the strange bright thing that lit in him every time their swords met. Instead, he forced himself still. Unohana came back into his line of sight. Today, she said, you learn to remain whole in the presence of possibility. That sounds like a waste of time. Yes, she said calmly, which is how I know you need it. Then she attacked. Not with the steel, with the wood. Fast, clean, precise. He brought his own practice blade up to meet hers, but she was already moving into the next strike, and the next after that, forcing him to defend without chasing openings, without lunging toward a finish, without letting instinct drag him into overcommitment. It was maddening. Every time he thought he saw the end of a sequence, she extended it. Every time he thought he could step in and force a conclusion, she punished the movement and reset the distance. He began to realize what she was doing. She was starving the part of him that wanted things to break quickly, making it wait, making it think, making him live inside unresolved motion. He hated it, which meant, increasingly, that he needed it. By the time the sun rose properly above the division roofs, his breathing had deepened, not from exhaustion but from the strain of restraint. Fighting hard was familiar. Holding himself inside a fight without lunging for the throat of it the moment it opened, that was harder than any alley knife brawl he had ever survived. Unohana knew it. That was why she was smiling, not broadly, not kindly. With that faint expression she wore when the lesson was cutting cleanly. They circled. He defended. She attacked. Then, suddenly, the steel in her other hand lifted, not toward him. Just enough for light to strike along the edge. His body reacted at once. The opening in his guard appeared like a reflex. Unohana's wooden sword touched his sternum. He froze. Again, she said. He exhaled through his nose, annoyed. They began once more. This time he told himself not to react to the steel. This time he lasted longer. This time he almost succeeded. Then the angle of her real blade shifted half an inch, and the old survival instinct flashed through him so hard that he moved to force distance before the thought fully formed. The wooden strike caught him across the ribs. He hissed and stepped back. Unohana lowered both weapons. You are still obeying fear faster than instruction. He rubbed once at his side, jaw tight. If someone pulls steel in Rukangai and I stop to think, I die? Yes, she said. And if someone stronger than you learns that all they have to do is show you death to control your body, then you die elsewhere too. Silence stretched. The point entered him like another strike. That was the worst thing about training with her. She never corrected only the surface of a mistake. She dug until she found the instinct beneath it. Then cut there. He took a breath. Then another, raised the practice blade again. Again, that earned him a look. A quiet one. Pleased. And somehow that pleased him right back in a way he absolutely did not want to examine. So they continued. By midday, his shirt clung damply to his back and chest, and the ache in his muscles had layered itself into something almost useful. The division grounds buzzed quietly beyond the training yard, but he no longer noticed the watchers the way he once had. They were there. He could feel their attention gathering beyond the thresholds, peeking from corridors, pausing in routes that suddenly became slower and more flexible whenever Captain Unohana's stray was under the sword again. He did not care. The world had narrowed, not because he was surviving it, because he was trying to master it. That difference changed the shape of his concentration. After water and food, the afternoon brought steel. Real steel. Unohana returned the practice sword to the rack and drew her blade fully. He felt the shift through his entire body. His own hand closed around his sword hilt. Good. Something in him thought at once. Unohana saw that too. It still excites you too quickly. He almost denied it. Then decided not to waste time lying. Yes. Her gaze held his a moment. That will make you dangerous. A pause. If you survive long enough to control it, he lifted his blade. So help me. The words left him before he could measure them. For the smallest instant, something changed in her face. Not shock, not even surprise exactly. Something quieter, something that settled deeper than approval. Then she raised her own sword. Come, he did. The clash came hard and immediate, ringing through the yard like struck iron. Everything he had been forced to learn in the last days leapt into motion at once. His feet found the ground with more intention. His shoulders stayed low longer. His center line remained tighter. He did not lunge at the first invitation. He let sequences breathe one strike longer, then two, then three, learning the shape of her rhythm before trying to cut into it. And because of that, he saw more. Not enough, never enough, but more. He saw where her calm ended and true pressure began. He saw how her blade moved differently when she was teaching versus when she was reminding him what a real swordswoman looked like. He saw most dangerously that the joy in her was growing with him. Not because he was close to beating her. He was not remotely, but because he was beginning to last in ways that mattered. That, more than anything, sharpened him. The fight stretched. Steel flashed. Several times she nearly had him, once at the throat, once at the knee, once with a turn of her wrist so perfect he understood only afterward how dead he would have been. Several times he surprised her too, though in smaller ways. A better recovery, a delayed commitment, a refusal to chase a false opening she had deliberately shown him. Each one drew that quiet look from her. There. Yes. Again. As if she were not merely training him, but watching something emerge that she had hoped existed long before she found proof of it. Late in the afternoon, the real lesson of the day revealed itself. Unohana pressed him hard, harder than she had since he entered Serite, driving him backward with a series of elegant, merciless cuts that left him no room to build the fight on his terms. Instinct howled at him to break the pattern, to rush, to force contact, to gamble on ending the exchange with violence before she drowned him in structure. He almost did. Then he remembered the wooden blade at his sternum, the steel lifting and his body betraying him, the word greedy he held. Just one beat longer, then another. He did not rush the possibility. He stayed inside it, and in that narrow, brutal patience, he found what she had been trying to show him all day. Her pressure had to reset, only slightly, only for an instant. But it did. His blade moved. Not wildly, not desperately, cleanly. He caught her sword just off its preferred line and forced her to angle her wrist differently than she intended. The exchange broke, not in his favor, but because of him. They separated. Silence hung between them. Unohana looked at him, not smiled, looked, as if measuring what had just changed. Then very quietly, there, his lungs burned. Sweat clung at the edge of his jaw. His hands ached from the repeated shocks of steel. But all of that vanished beneath the hot, fierce satisfaction flooding him. I saw it, he said. Yes, you had to change. Yes. The word landed like sunlight through cloud. Not victory. Something better. Proof. Unohana lowered her blade. The look in her eyes now was not simply approval. It was recognition sharpened into interest. And beneath that, something close to pride again. You're beginning to understand how to shape a fight, she said. He swallowed once. Because you keep trying to force me into the wrong shape. The corner of her mouth lifted. Exactly. He lowered his sword only because she did. The yard had gone quiet around them. He noticed, dimly, that the usual watchers had gone still as statues beyond the open boundary of the training ground, every eye fixed on the pair of them. They had seen enough to understand that something had happened, even if they lacked the precision to name it. He did not care about them. He cared about the way Unohana was looking at him, as if he had confirmed something she had already suspected. As if each day he remained under her blade, he ceased being a stray she had brought in from the outer districts and became more clearly something that belonged inside the shape of her future. That thought should have sent him running. Instead, it made his chest feel strange and steady all at once. By evening, she dismissed him with less formal distance than before. Rest your wrist, she said as they walked from the yard. You're compensating with the shoulder again. He glanced at her. You noticed? That earned him a look from the corner of her eye that made the answer obvious before she gave it.
I notice everything.
He believed her. They walked side by side through the deepening light of the division, and the difference in that arrangement did not escape him. Once, he had followed behind her out of instinct and caution. Then because that was where her shadow belonged. Now, without either of them speaking of it, he had drifted nearer, close enough that their steps matched. Not equal, Not yet, but closer. The realization sat between them, unspoken. Neither moved away. The evening passed into night. He treated the bruises, ate, and sat for a long while with his sword across his lap, replaying the exact instant he had forced her to change her angle. The memory glowed inside him. Small, hard, precious. He rose after dark. Again. This time he did not bother pretending he had another reason. He went back to the yard because he wanted to, because she would probably be there, because some part of him had already begun measuring the day not by dawn and dusk, but by when his blade met hers. The moonlit training ground waited, and so did she. Unohana stood near the edge this time, one sleeve pushed back slightly as she adjusted the wrap at her wrist. When she heard his footsteps, she looked up, and something in her expression softened in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. "You really do come back every night?" "Yes." "Why?" The answer came more easily now, though not easier to say, "Because I'm thinking about it, about the lesson, about all of it." Her eyes held him. Then she nodded once. "Good." He stepped into the yard and stopped a few paces from her. For a while, neither reached for a weapon. The quiet settled around them. Not tense, not empty. The kind of quiet that belongs only to two people who have already crossed enough steel to stop fearing silence. Then Unohana said, "Tell me what you learned." He frowned faintly, thinking, "That I rushed the end? Yes. That fear can move me before thought? Yes. That if I wait too long, I lose the fight." He paused. "But if I refuse to wait at all, I give it away." A small smile returned. "Better?" He looked at her, and because the moonlight was cleaner than daylight, and the dark let honesty travel in narrower forms, he added, "And that when you say they're like that." She tilted her head. "Like what?" He realized too late that he had begun a sentence without knowing how to finish it. Her gaze sharpened with amusement. He looked away first. "Nothing." Unohana laughed softly. "No. Tell me." He could have refused. Should have. Instead he muttered, still not fully facing her, "It feels like I'm real." Silence. Not the easy kind. The kind that forms after something true leaves the mouth and both people must decide how to hold it. When he finally looked back, Unohana's expression had changed. Not into pity, never that. Into something infinitely more dangerous, tenderness. Only a little, only for a moment, but enough to make his pulse trip. "You are real," she said quietly. The words should have been obvious. They were not to him, not after years of being treated as something useful, disposable, threatening, feral, nameless. No one had ever said anything like that to him with full certainty, as if the fact itself should have been beyond question. He stood very still. Unohana stepped closer. Not enough to touch, enough to make the space between them matter. "When I say there," she said, "it is because I can see you reaching yourself." The night seemed to narrow around the words. He could not answer, so she spared him, as she always did when honesty cut too deep. Unohana lifted a practice sword from the rack and offered it to him. "One more hour?" He took it, and in the moonlit quiet of Serite, beneath white roofs and open sky, they began again. Bleach, crimson Kenpachi. Chapter 6, The Hour That Changed the Distance. Did not feel like training, not the way mornings did. Morning belonged to correction, to structure, to the hard, clean work of tearing weakness out by the root and replacing it with something sharper. Morning belonged to sunlight on stone, and the sound of steel carrying across the 4th Division, until everyone nearby knew Captain Unohana was shaping something dangerous again. Night was different. Night belonged to quiet, to the spaces between words, to the strange, narrowing world that seemed to appear whenever the rest of Serite softened into sleep, and only the two of them remained in the yard, with moonlight silvering the stone and lantern glow catching at the edges of their forms. Kurogen, still nameless, still only himself, stood with the practice sword in hand and Unohana across from him, and for the first time since entering Siriti, he realized he could feel the difference before they even moved. She was calmer at night, not weaker, never that, but less hidden. In daylight, she wore the shape expected of her. Captain, healer, perfect calm draped neatly over danger so old and deep most of the division only sensed it by instinct. At night, pieces of that careful shape loosened. Her voice softened in different places. The pauses in her silence changed. The look in her eyes when she studied him carried less distance. It made the hour feel more dangerous than the day ever did. Unohana lifted her wooden blade. "Show me." No command beyond that, no explanation. He understood anyway. The first strike came clean and direct. She met it with a short turn of the wrist, letting his blade slide off the line she occupied, and answered with a quick touch toward his shoulder. He moved under it, adjusted his feet, and came again before the opening closed. The sound of wood striking wood snapped through the quiet yard. Again, again, again. Not hard enough to bruise immediately. Hard enough to matter. Their movements in the moonlight took on a different rhythm than during the day. Less brutal in appearance. More precise. The exchanges were shorter, sharper, stripped of the wide educational pattern she used in the mornings. She was not dismantling him openly now. She was refining him, testing whether what had entered his body through repetition could remain there when the pressure became lighter and more subtle. It was harder than the daylight lessons. By the fifth exchange, he understood why. Morning made mistakes loud. Night made them quiet. Morning let him see failure in the obvious things. His footing, his timing, his bad habits, the places where old survival instincts dragged him out of shape. Night found the mistakes hiding underneath those. The barely too early breath, the shoulder that tightened a fraction before commitment, the eye line that betrayed where he wanted the fight to go. The reflex to search her expression for approval in the instant after he did something right. That last one nearly got him struck across the throat. Unohana's practice blade stopped just short of his neck. He went still. Her eyes held his. "You left the fight." He frowned immediately, annoyed with her and more annoyed with himself. "I didn't." "You did." Her voice remained calm, but there was no softness in the lesson. "You looked at me instead of the exchange." He said nothing. Because again, she was right. Unohana lowered her blade slowly. "Do you know why?" "No." "Yes, you do." He looked away first, jaw tightening. That tiny, humiliating truth sat in the air between them. Because he wanted to know whether she had seen it, whether she approved, whether he had earned that quiet look again. He hated that he wanted it. Unohana saw every piece of that cross his face, and for once she did not press the point with more words. She simply stepped back into position. Again. He came at her harder than necessary, because anger was easier to manage than embarrassment. She turned it aside with absurd ease. The lesson went on. Moonlight shifted gradually over the training ground, pale across stone, then silver along the edges of the weapon racks. Somewhere in the distance, water moved through the channels bordering the division. Farther still, a night bell sounded once and fell silent again. The rest of Soul Society might as well not have existed. Only this yard did, only this hour, only her. That truth had begun settling into him so thoroughly that he did not know what shape his days had before it. Unohana circled him once, then stopped. "Hold the blade higher," he adjusted. "No, not from the elbow." He changed it again. She stepped forward and, with 2 fingers and the lightest pressure against his wrist, corrected the angle herself. His body reacted instantly, not outwardly. He did not flinch, but awareness moved through him like sudden heat. She was close. Close enough for the clean scent of night air and faint medicinal herbs to reach him. Close enough that if she raised the practice sword now, she could strike him before thought fully returned. Close enough that the pale fabric of her sleeve brushed the edge of his hand for one brief accidental second. Unohana noticed. Of course she did. Her hand withdrew almost at once, but not abruptly. She never moved abruptly unless she meant to teach through it. Her expression remained composed, though something in her gaze sharpened and then gentled by an amount so slight another person might have missed it. "Again," she said. His voice came out flatter than he intended. "Yes," they resumed. But now his concentration had changed shape. That irritated him enough to make him cleaner for the next several passes. He stopped reaching for reaction and instead narrowed himself into the line of the fight, holding his attention inside the sound and feel of impact until the yard, the moonlight, the night, and her nearness all fused into the same hard focus. That apparently pleased her. "There," Unohana said quietly after one especially sharp exchange, where he kept his center and refused the false opening she showed him. "Better," he exhaled once. The word landed where it always did, not in pride. Somewhere stranger, somewhere more dangerous. She attacked immediately after giving it, and because he was still thinking about the sound of her approval, she clipped his wrist hard enough to sting. His blade dipped. Her next strike touched his sternum. "See?" she said. His eyes narrowed. "You did that on purpose. Yes, that's unfair." A small smile appeared. There is no fair in learning. He almost said there was no fair anywhere, but she already knew that. She was the one who had dragged him into a world where that old truth no longer worked the same way. The hour stretched. His body warmed into the rhythm of it. The ache in his shoulders settled into a more useful burn. His wrists adjusted to the repeated impact. His breathing steadied. He began to realize that what she was building now was not only skill, it was comfort inside pressure. Not ease, never ease, but the ability to remain whole inside a fight that had not yet declared its ending. That had been his greatest weakness from the beginning. Every battle in Rukongai had trained him toward the same instinct. Find the break, force the collapse, end it before the world takes your chance away. Unohana was teaching him a colder, harder lesson. A real fight between true swordsmen did not always reveal its end quickly. Sometimes it demanded patience sharp enough to feel like its own form of violence. He was beginning to understand that. He was beginning more dangerously to enjoy it. At some point he stopped noticing that he was tired. At some point he stopped thinking of the hour as extra training after the real lessons of the day and started understanding it for what it actually was. This was where the distance between them changed. Morning gave him instruction. Night gave him access, not to her fully, not even close, but to a quieter shape of her, a more private one. The one that did not need to speak as captain first. The one that watched him not as a project or problem, but as something she had chosen and continued choosing. The thought rose without invitation and sat in his chest like a live thing. It changed his next exchange. Unohana moved in lightly, expecting him to meet the practice blade at a familiar angle. Instead, he delayed half a breath, let the line of contact shift, and slid inside her preferred rhythm before turning his own blade sharply upward. Wood cracked against wood. Not a strike landed, but for the first time that night, she had to step back. A real step. Not much. Enough. The yard went still. So did he. Unohana looked at him, and then, slowly, she smiled. Not the amused curve she gave his stubbornness. Not the faint pleased look she wore when he corrected something she had already shown him. This was different. Brighter. Warmer. Prouder. And because it was all of those things at once, it hit him like a blow. There, she said again, softer this time. You felt it? Yes, he answered before he could stop himself. The words came low and immediate. Not because she had spoken. Because she was right. He had felt it. Not the opening. The shape. For one clear instant, he had not been chasing her movement or reacting to pressure or trying to win the exchange too quickly. He had entered the flow of it and altered the line from within. He had shaped it. Small, brief, but real. Unohana seemed to understand exactly what the moment meant to him because her gaze remained on his face a breath longer than usual before she stepped in again. Again, he came at her immediately. Now the hour sharpened. The quiet warmth of the moment did not disappear, but it threaded itself through something fiercer. He wanted that look again, that recognition, not because he was needy, not because he wanted praise like a child, because in her face, for those few breaths, he had seen proof that the thing he was becoming was visible outside himself. He existed more clearly in her eyes. That realization frightened him enough to make him better. The next exchanges came fast and clean. Their wooden swords snapped together under moonlight, separated, collided again. Each time he held his shape longer. Each time she had to use more of her real attention to keep him from altering the structure of the fight. He did not hit her. Not once. But that no longer felt like the only meaningful measure. By the time she finally lowered her blade, his forearms trembled faintly from repeated impact and effort. Sweat cooled at the line of his neck. His chest rose and fell deeper than before. He was tired in a way that reached beyond muscle and into concentration itself. Unohana watched him breathe for a moment, then said, "Enough." He did not argue. That alone made her eyes soften. They moved to the edge of the training ground and sat in the moonlit quiet with a small distance between them. Not enough to feel formal, not so little that either had to acknowledge it. The night air cooled the sweat on his skin. Somewhere nearby, leaves stirred softly in the dark. Unohana folded one leg beneath her and rested her hands loosely in her lap. "You learned faster tonight." He was still breathing a little hard when he answered. "That was going to be my question." He glanced at her. Moonlight made her face look strangely softer without taking anything dangerous from it. He looked away first. "I stopped trying to finish it." "Yes, and..." He frowned slightly. "I stopped trying to prove it too early." Unohana said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, "Yes." The silence that followed felt full. He looked down at his hand resting beside the practice sword. "Is that enough?" The question surprised him after it left his mouth. Not because he had asked it. Because he had meant it in more ways than one. Enough for the lesson. Enough for the day. Enough for her. Unohana heard all the meanings anyway. He knew she did by the way her gaze changed before she spoke. "For tonight?" she said. "Yes." He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Unohana watched him do it. You always ask the question after the lesson, never during it. He frowned. What question? Whether what you did mattered, that annoyed him enough to cover the discomfort. If it didn't matter, you wouldn't still be here. That made her laugh, soft, low, and unexpectedly pleased. No, she admitted. I would not. He held still after that. The answer settled into him slowly. Not because it was dramatic, because it was plain, true. She was here because he mattered enough to keep being here for. No one had ever said that to him in any form before. The silence deepened. Neither seemed eager to break it. After a while, Unohana asked, "What did you think Serete would be like?" He glanced at her, surprised by the question. I didn't. Yes, you did. He frowned and thought about it. A cage, he said at last. Unohana did not flinch at the answer. Instead, she looked out across the moonlit yard. And now? He considered that longer. It would have been easier to lie, to say he still distrusted it the same way, to cling to the old shape of himself simply because it was familiar. But that felt useless here. She saw through useless things too quickly. A place where I might get stronger. Unohana's expression did not change much. But the little that did was enough. Good, that word again. Always somehow deeper than it sounded. He looked toward her before he meant to and found her already looking at him. For a brief, quiet moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not master and student, not yet what it would become later. Something more fragile and more dangerous than either of those things. Recognition without defense. It unsettled him enough that he stood. The movement made her brows lift slightly. You're leaving? Yes. Why? Because if I stay here looking at you while the night is like this, something in me is going to become harder to hide. He had no words for that. So he chose the simpler truth. Because if I don't sleep, I'll be slower tomorrow. Unohana regarded him for a beat, then nodded once. That's true. He took up the practice blade and returned it to the rack. When he turned back, she was still sitting at the edge of the yard, moonlight across her sleeve, dark hair falling straight over one shoulder. He hesitated. She noticed immediately. What is it? He looked at her, then at the empty yard, then back. When I force you to move like that? Her expression changed, small, attentive, waiting. Yes, I like it. The honesty sat between them, raw, simple. Unohana's eyes warmed. Yes, she said quietly. I know, the answer should have embarrassed him. Instead, it did something worse. It made him feel understood. He did not know what to do with that, so he turned to leave. Behind him, he heard her rise. Then her voice reached him one last time before he stepped out of the yard. You are beginning to find the shape of your blade. He looked back. Unohana stood in the center of the moonlit ground, calm and certain as ever. But do not confuse that, she said, with finding the end of it. He held her gaze for a second, then nodded once, and left. The room was dark when he returned. He cleaned the sweat from his skin, treated the fresh ache in his wrist, and lay down with his sword within reach. Sleep did not come immediately this time. Not because the room felt unfamiliar, because his mind kept replaying the steps she had taken back. The look in her eyes after, the quiet certainty in the way she had said I know. Beyond the room, Serite breathed in its ordered sleep. Somewhere under that same sky, Unohana remained awake a while longer. And in the small darkness between wakefulness and sleep, the nameless boy lay still and realized with something dangerously close to wonder that the distance between them had changed again. Not enough to name, enough to matter. Bleach, Crimson Kenpachi, Chapter 7, The Sound of Her Voice. By the next evening, he had started measuring the day in two halves. The first belonged to the sun. The second belonged to her. Morning came with steel, correction, impact, and the bright, hard labor of being broken down in all the places Rukongai had built him badly. Daylight belonged to discipline. It belonged to the shape of the sword, to posture and patience and breath, and the countless tiny brutal truths that separated survival from mastery. Night belonged to something else. Not softness, not peace. Something quieter, and because of that, sharper. It belonged to the hour when the division dimmed, when the watchful eyes withdrew behind paper doors and shadowed corridors, when even Serete seemed to know enough not to intrude too deeply on the moonlit training ground where Captain Unohana and the nameless boy kept finding new ways to cut the distance between them. He had not meant for that hour to become necessary. But by the seventh day, when dusk began bleeding across the white walls and polished stone of the 4th Division, he already felt it approaching in him like hunger. The realization annoyed him. It did not change anything. He spent the afternoon training harder because of it. Unohana noticed immediately. Of course she did. She noticed the extra force in his wrists, the deeper set of his shoulders, the sharper edge in the way he stepped into each exchange. She noticed that the irritation was not directed at her, not exactly, but at something inside himself he had not yet decided how to name. And because she was who she was, she did not ask what was wrong. She made him deal with it through the sword. The day's lesson began with steel and ended in bruises. She kept him in motion for hours, forcing him through long, punishing exchanges that denied him any clean ending. Whenever he tried to drive a sequence toward finality too soon, she dismantled him. Whenever he overreached, she punished the impatience. When frustration made him faster, she made speed a weakness by turning it back on him until he learned to separate quickness from haste. The sun descended through the sky one relentless correction at a time. At one point she drove him so hard across the yard that his heel caught on a crack in the stone and he nearly went down. He recovered on instinct, twisted, and brought his blade up just in time to catch hers before it broke through his guard. The impact jarred all the way through his shoulder. Unohana stopped. Not because he had failed, because he had adapted. For one narrow, perfect instant, he had turned a mistake into a line of survival without giving panic the chance to shape it. She saw it. There. He was breathing hard, sweat cooling on his skin under the late-day air. I know. A faint smile touched her mouth. So you do. That did something infuriating to his chest. He attacked again to get rid of it. She laughed under her breath and met the blade. By the time she finally dismissed him for the evening, his body ached everywhere worth aching. He had a fresh mark across one forearm, where she had corrected his angle too sharply for him to avoid the lesson. His thighs burned from repeated changes in stance and pressure. His wrists felt heavy and alive. His breathing at last had learned to stay under him even when he was exhausted. He washed, ate, and spent all of 20 heartbeats pretending he might stay inside his room this time. Then he rose, took up his sword, and stepped back into the night. The path to the training ground had become familiar. That fact unsettled him almost as much as the truth beneath it. The division's stone walkways glowed pale under lantern light. Water moved softly through the channels beside them. Somewhere farther off, a pair of healers crossed one of the elevated corridors, speaking in low voices that stopped entirely when they noticed him. Their silence followed him for 3 steps after he passed. He ignored it. The moon was high enough to silver the training yard by the time he arrived. Unohana was already there. She stood near the rack of wooden swords, not facing him this time. Her gaze rested on the open sky above the courtyard, one hand lightly touching the hilt at her side, not drawing, only resting there. She looked unguarded in a way that made him stop at the edge of the yard instead of stepping directly in. He had never seen her like that. Still dangerous, yes. She was always dangerous. But for those few quiet seconds before she turned and noticed him, she looked almost alone. The thought came and settled before he could shake it off. Unohana heard him anyway. She always did. Without any visible start, she turned her head slightly and looked toward him over one shoulder. You came, yes. She turned fully then, and whatever quiet had been in her face changed into something more legible. Not the healer's smile, not the captain's composure, something for him. You hesitated. He stepped into the yard at last. I was looking at what? He thought about lying. He did not. At you. That made the corner of her mouth lift. And he frowned slightly because he disliked answering questions he had not fully answered for himself first. You were quiet. Unohana held his gaze a second longer than usual. Does that trouble you? No, the answer came too quickly. It made her smile widen. You don't like being caught. I don't care. No, she said softly. You care very much. He looked away first. That was becoming a pattern he resented. Unohana let him have the silence that followed, then stepped toward the rack and lifted a single wooden blade. She did not offer it to him immediately. Instead, she asked, What do you hear when I speak? The question caught him off guard enough that he looked back at once. What? When I correct you. When I tell you to stop. When I say your stance is wrong, or your timing, or your breathing. She tilted her head slightly. What do you hear? He stared at her. It felt like a trick. He did not understand the shape of the lesson yet, and that put him on edge. Unohana seemed to know that too. That is the lesson tonight, she said. She offered him the wooden blade then. He took it slowly. You want me to listen? Yes, that's not fighting. It is if you've spent your whole life only listening for danger. He said nothing after that, because again, there she was, sliding beneath the obvious shape of his habits and putting her fingers on the thing under them. They took their places across from one another. Moonlight laid silver along the stone between them. Unohana raised her wooden sword and said, "Very quietly, come." He moved. The clash came and went in an instant. Wood snapped against wood. He pivoted into the next angle. She met it. He drove forward, and her voice cut through the exchange. Too loud. The words struck him almost as hard as the next blow. His blade shuddered under the impact as she turned his attack aside and touched the wooden sword to his shoulder. He stepped back, annoyed. What does that mean? It means your body is speaking before your sword does. She stepped in again. Again. He came at her harder this time, half because he wanted to understand and half because confusion made him meaner. The exchange stretched. 3 strikes, 5, 7. Then, too eager? The words came during motion, not after it, and somehow that made them enter him differently. His body reacted to the correction a fraction before his mind organized it. He adjusted mid-sequence, not enough to fix the exchange, but enough that when her next strike landed, it was on his forearm instead of his throat. Unohana's eyes sharpened. There, he saw it too. Not the praise, the mechanism. Her voice inside the fight was doing something his instincts recognized faster than explanation ever could. He swallowed once and reset his stance. Again, this time she attacked first. Her wooden blade moved cleanly toward his left shoulder, then dropped lower, then rose again in a pattern meant less to land and more to provoke response. He held his ground, waited, listened. The moment he tensed too early, her voice touched the air. Not yet. He stopped the commitment before it fully formed. His body corrected itself. The attack passed. His eyes widened a fraction. Unohana saw that too. Yes, she said. Again, what followed began to feel less like sparring and more like something stranger. A conversation. Not in words alone. In voice, timing, pressure, and trust. She would strike, and inside the exchange her voice would move with the blade. Lower. Wait, now. Too much. There. Sometimes the correction came before the mistake fully appeared, sometimes as it began, sometimes after when the lesson needed pain to stay in him. Gradually, to his own growing disbelief, he found that he could hear her voice even while his body was moving at fighting speed. Not as a distraction, as structure. The realization should have bothered him more than it did, because it meant he was allowing someone else inside his instincts, allowing her there. No one had ever been there before. No one had survived close enough. The hour deepened around them. The rest of Sarite receded. The only sounds left were the crack of wood, the rhythm of breath, the occasional shift of cloth, and her voice, quiet, calm, impossibly precise. He began to understand the lesson then. In Rukangai, voices had meant threat, lies, panic, bluffing, begging, orders from people who wanted him smaller than he was. Her voice inside a fight meant something entirely different. Not control, guidance, not the kind that weakened him, the kind that let him reach what he could not quite see alone. That truth unsettled him enough that he missed an easy opening she deliberately left in front of him. Unohana's practice blade touched the center of his chest. He stared then at her. She lowered the weapon. You left the fight again. He exhaled hard through his nose. Yes, why? He hesitated. That was answer enough. Unohana waited. The moonlight made her face look softer than daylight did, but it did nothing to lessen the steadiness of her gaze. Finally, he said, "Because I heard you." A small silence followed. Then she asked very carefully, "And that disturbed you?" He looked away. "Yes, why?" The answer came sharper than he intended. "Because I shouldn't need it." Unohana did not flinch. "Need what?" He tightened his grip on the wooden sword. "You in the fight." "There," said. The words entered the night and changed it. The air between them seemed to thin, not with tension, with truth. Unohana's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough that he felt it all the way to his spine. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before. "You don't need me in the fight." He forced himself to meet her eyes again. "It helps?" "Yes," she said. "It does." No mockery, no correction, just acceptance. That somehow hit harder than if she had challenged him. She stepped closer, not near enough to touch, near enough to matter. "When a blade is being forged," she said quietly, It does not become weaker because it is struck with intention. He held still. It becomes clearer. He looked at her in silence. Moonlight gathered pale along the line of her sleeve. The night breeze moved one dark strand of hair across her cheek and left it there. She made no move to brush it away. "You hear my voice because I am teaching you to hear yourself sooner," she continued. The words entered him slowly, deeply. "You are not borrowing my instincts." A pause. "You are learning the shape your own can take." He did not know what expression crossed his face then. He only knew Unohana saw it and gentled further in response. No pity, never that. Something else, something more dangerous. Understanding. The nameless boy had spent years letting his body respond to danger faster than thought because there had been no other choice. Now here was a woman standing under the moon telling him that what he heard in her voice was not dependence. It was refinement. He believed her. That frightened him most of all. Unohana stepped back then, not far, only enough to return the fight to its proper shape. Again, this time, when he raised the wooden sword, the motion felt different. Not lighter, more certain. They began once more, and now the lesson cut deeper. She spoke. He listened, but where before her voice had felt like an outside force entering his focus, now it moved inside the exchange as if uncovering what had already begun living there. His body adjusted more cleanly. His timing settled. He stopped bracing against her words and started letting them sharpen him. The change was immediate. On the next sequence, she drove 3 quick strikes at him in a pattern designed to force retreat. He did not retreat. He shifted. Waited through the false urgency, heard her say, "Now," and moved at the exact right instant, not because the word commanded him, but because he already felt the line opening under it. Their blades met. His angle held. Unohana's eyes widened slightly, not with surprise that he had improved, with satisfaction that he understood. "There," she said again, and this time the sound of it felt different too. Not just recognition, pride. The hour that followed became the most fluid they had yet shared, not because he won anything. He did not. Not because he struck her. He did not, because, for the first time, the fight between them carried less friction and more accord. Her voice entered the exchange, his body met it without resistance. The lines of movement sharpened under both. They were still captain and student, still teacher and the blade she was forging, but the shape of the lesson had become collaborative in a way neither had named aloud. It was dangerous. It was beautiful. It left him breathless in more ways than one. At last Unohana lowered the practice sword and the yard fell quiet around them. This time when she said, "Enough," he obeyed immediately, not from exhaustion, from trust. The recognition of that truth arrived a beat later and nearly made him turn on himself. Instead, he carried the wooden sword back to the rack and set it down with more care than he intended anyone to notice. When he turned around, Unohana was watching him. Not with amusement, with that same infuriating, quiet attentiveness that saw too much. He crossed back to the edge of the yard and sat, forearms resting lightly on his knees. Unohana joined him after a moment. Neither spoke at first. The night had deepened. Somewhere beyond the division walls, the city of the dead continued its ordered breathing. In the 4th division, lights had gone out in most of the upper rooms. The world had drawn itself inward around their silence. After a while, Unohana said, "You learned quickly tonight." He looked down at his hands. "They weren't really your instructions." Her brows lifted faintly. "No." He shook his head once. "They were confirmations." The slightest shift touched her expression. That answer pleased her in a deeper way than anything he had said all night. "Yes," she said softly. "Exactly." He let that sit between them. Then, because the question had been pressing against the inside of his ribs for longer than he wanted to admit, he asked, "Why do you keep doing this?" Unohana turned her head. "Doing what? This?" He gestured once, vaguely, at the yard, the moonlight, the stillness between them, everything that had become impossible to separate. "After the day is over. After I already trained?" Her gaze remained on him. A long breath passed before she answered. "Because the day teaches your body." Another breath. "The night reaches the rest of you." He stilled. The words found places in him he had not protected well enough. Unohana looked away first this time, out across the moonlit stone. "You survived by becoming sharp enough to cut what threatened you," she said. "But you are more than that. If I only train your sword arm, I leave the rest of the blade unfinished." His throat felt strangely tight. No one had ever spoken about him as if there were a whole thing there to be finished. No one had ever implied he was worth that much work. He did not know how to answer. Maybe Unohana knew that. Maybe she only knew when to stop cutting. Either way, she let the silence settle without asking more of him. Eventually, he said, quieter than he meant to, "I like hearing your voice in the fight there. Another truth. Plain. Dangerous." Unohana turned back toward him. The moonlight caught in her eyes. "For the lesson?" He shook his head once, not enough to hide behind. "No." A faint smile touched her mouth. That answer, too, she understood without forcing him to explain. For a long second, neither of them moved. Then Unohana rose. He almost protested, not aloud. His body betrayed it in the slight lift of his head, the way his attention sharpened as if bracing against the end of the hour. She noticed. Again. Always. "We're done," she said gently. He stood too, slower this time. "Yes." Unohana took one step toward the path leading out of the yard, then paused. Without looking directly at him, she said, "You hear my voice because you trust it." The words stopped him cold. She turned her head just enough to catch his expression from the corner of her eye. "And that," she added, "is not weakness." Then she left him standing in the moonlight, with the practice yard empty, the rack of wooden swords still, and his own pulse beating harder than it should have under his skin. He did not follow immediately. He stood there long after her footsteps had faded, staring across the place where they had just fought, replaying every quiet correction, every strike, every moment where her voice had entered the exchange and made him better. Trust. The word sat inside him like something newly alive. He did not know what to do with it. So he held still and let it hurt a little. Back in his room, sleep came later than usual. He lay on the futon with his sword within reach and listened to the silence of Serite pressing gently around the walls. His body was tired. His mind was not. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard it again. Too loud. Not yet. Now, there, and beneath all of those, the quieter thing, the truth she had left him with. You trust it. He did. That was the problem. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was becoming something else entirely. When sleep finally took him, it did so in the shape of her voice. Bleach, Crimson Kenpachi. Chapter 8, the place he stopped watching. The next morning, he woke before dawn again. Not because the room felt wrong anymore. That was what unsettled him first. He woke, sat up, and for one small, dangerous second did not reach for the sword immediately. The habit returned a breath later, his hand finding the hilt by instinct. But the gap existed. It had happened. His body had opened its eyes into stillness, and not immediately expected violence. He sat there in the dark, hand around the sword, and stared at nothing. That was new. He disliked new things when they happened inside him. He rose anyway. The room held the pale shape of pre-dawn, gray light barely beginning to gather at the edge of the window frame. The folded clothes were where they should be. The floor was clean. The walls stood quiet and unworried around him. His body still carried the ache of yesterday's training, but not in the same scattered way as before. The soreness had started organizing itself. His shoulders hurt where they had worked. His thighs burned where his stance had deepened. His wrist, which Unohana had warned him about, remained tender but no longer weak. He washed, dressed, took up his sword, and stepped into the corridor. The air outside felt cooler than usual, touched by rain somewhere distant, or perhaps simply the threat of it. The division had not fully awakened yet. Lamps still glowed in sheltered alcoves. Early attendants moved like shadows with folded cloth, trays, and silent purpose. The channels running beside the walkways whispered softly over stone. And beneath all of it, her. He felt Unohana before he saw the yard. That was not new. But what had changed was the shape of his reaction. The first days, her presence had hit him like warning, then like challenge, then like hunger. Now it settled him. He stopped walking, only for a second, because that was new too. More dangerous than all the rest. He could feel it clearly if he chose to look directly at it. The sound of her voice in the fight had stayed with him so strongly that now, before sunrise, the simple fact of her being ahead in the training ground did not sharpen him into tension. It drew him into focus, like the moment before steel met steel, only steadier. He hated how much that mattered. Then he resumed walking, face already flattening into its usual unreadable line by the time he stepped into the yard. Unohana stood where she always did, pale against the dim blue of early morning, the long line of her dark hair resting still down her back. She had not drawn a weapon yet. Her hands remained within her sleeves, expression composed, eyes already on him when he arrived. He stopped a few paces away. "You're on time," she said. He frowned instantly. "Today?" The faintest smile appeared. Yes. He looked at her for a moment, then toward the practice rack, then back. "What's the lesson?" Unohana studied him with that same irritating completeness that made lying feel useless before he even attempted it. "Today," she said, "we find the place inside a fight where you stop watching me." He went still. The words landed too directly. Unohana saw that too. Do you know what I mean? No. Yes, she said gently. You do. He looked away first, annoyed. Because he did, at least partly. She was talking about the moments he kept losing. Not losing with the sword. Losing inside himself. Those brief, dangerous breaths when the fight loosened just enough for him to notice her as more than the blade coming toward him. The way her eyes changed when he understood. The way her voice settled into the exchange. The way approval in her face reached places in him no one had touched before. The way sometimes, when she stood too close while correcting his wrist or shoulder or stance, his body became aware of her before it remembered the lesson. That was what she meant. The place where he stopped watching the fight and started watching her. He gripped the hilt of his sword a little tighter. That's not a lesson. Yes, it is. How? Unohana stepped toward the rack and selected steel, not wood. Because if your focus leaves the blade for the woman holding it, she said quietly, someone better than me will kill you. The answer was so clean, so mercilessly practical, that it cut through his irritation at once. Of course. Of course she would name it that way. Not as embarrassment, not as some softer weakness to be hidden and ignored, as danger, as a flaw in combat, something to be cut out or mastered, that he understood. He drew his sword. Good, Unohana said, seeing the shift in him. Now come. He moved fast, not out of impatience, to get rid of thought. The first clash rang sharply through the dawn. Steel met steel in a burst of cold sound and immediate pressure. Unohana turned his strike aside and answered with one angled toward his left shoulder. He caught it, adjusted, slid out of the line, and came again. Their blades moved quickly enough that the morning light seemed slower by comparison. She was pressing him early. No slow correction, no patient entry into the lesson. She was already inside it. He understood why after the fourth exchange, because the problem she was hunting in him appeared only when the fight loosened enough to let thought wander. So she gave him no looseness, not at first. They moved harder and faster than usual for the opening of the day. Her blade forced him to stay in the structure of impact, footwork, timing, and breath. He responded in kind, drawing on everything the last week had carved into him. His stance held better. His shoulders remained looser. He no longer chased the first sign of ending. He no longer panicked when she vanished and reappeared at a punishing angle. He had become cleaner. She saw that. But she saw more than that. Eventually, as the sky lightened and the stone yard began to gather color, Unohana changed the rhythm. The exchange slowed, not in speed, in space. She gave him a longer line to enter, a wider recovery after one of her own cuts, a slightly fuller look at her face across the crossing of their swords. The opening was deliberate. He knew it was deliberate, and still, for one dangerous heartbeat, he saw her. Not the cut, not the angle, her, the calm in her expression, the faint awareness in her eyes, the almost hidden satisfaction that appeared when he held the line correctly and did not overreach. His body followed that look for a fraction too long. Her blade tapped the inside of his wrist. Pain flashed. His sword dipped. The next strike stopped at his throat. Silence. Her voice came low and close across the crossed steel. There. He swallowed once, anger burning hot and immediate beneath the skin. Not at her, at himself. Unohana withdrew her blade. He stepped back, jaw tight. You left the fight. I know. Where did you go? The question made him look at her sharply. Not because he misunderstood it, because he understood too well. He said nothing. Unohana waited. The dawn wind moved through the yard, lifting a strand of dark hair across her cheek before letting it fall again. Somewhere beyond the training ground, distant footsteps crossed stone. The rest of the division continued waking around them. Inside the yard, only the silence mattered. At last he said, flatly, you know. Yes, she said. I want to hear whether you do. He looked away. His hand flexed once around the sword hilt. Then, because there was no point in lying where she was concerned, and even less point in lying where the sword was concerned, he answered. I looked at your face. The words sat between them. Bear. Unohana's gaze did not soften into mercy. It sharpened into understanding. Why? He almost laughed at that. Because she keeps asking questions with answers too large to fit cleanly in the mouth. Because when you look at me after I do something right, it feels like the world stops being empty for a moment. Because your voice in a fight doesn't unsettle me anymore. It steadies me. Because you matter too much inside the hour when we're alone in the yard. He had none of those sentences. So he gave her the smallest true one. Because I wanted to know what you saw. Unohana went very still. The silence after that was different. Heavier. Not bad. Just harder to stand inside. Then she stepped forward again, but not into attack range, into speaking range. That, she said quietly, is not the same mistake as losing yourself to admiration. He blinked. The phrasing caught him off guard enough that the anger in him shifted. What? You were not staring because you forgot the fight. Her gaze held his. You were checking whether your movement reached me. The truth of that landed so exactly that he could not deny it even if he wanted to. Unohana saw the recognition move through him. Yes, she said. That is why it is dangerous. He frowned. Why? Because wanting to be seen can pull you out of the blade just as quickly as fear. The words entered him like ice water. That one he had not known. Not properly. Fear he understood. Fear moved the body. Fear sharpened or ruined. Fear had shaped whole years of his life. But this need to know whether his movement mattered to someone who understood exactly what it cost him to make it. This was newer and somehow more dangerous. Because it felt good. Unohana's voice gentled by one small degree. You are beginning to fight for more than survival now. He said nothing. Because yes, that was it. She stepped back at last and raised her sword again. So now, she said, you learn how to keep the blade clean even when the heart is not. Then she attacked. The next hours were among the hardest yet. Not because she struck harder, because she struck truer. She hunted exactly that weakness in him, over and over, turning the lesson until he could no longer hide from it. Sometimes she let an exchange open just enough for him to glimpse her expression. Sometimes she corrected him in that quiet, precise voice, and watched to see whether listening made him lean toward her instead of toward the line of the fight. Sometimes she gave him the look he wanted, approval, interest, that dangerous private pride, and punished him the instant he reached for it. Each time, the lesson cut deeper. Each time, he learned a little more about the difference between receiving and chasing. That was the shape of the morning. If she said there and he heard it, good. If he shifted toward hearing it again before the blade required it, she struck. If her voice entered the exchange and steadied him, good. If he waited for the voice instead of feeling the line himself, she struck. By noon, his frustration had burned itself into something colder, more useful. He began to understand. She was not cutting away his awareness of her. She was cutting away his dependence on response. The difference mattered. It changed the next sequence entirely. She pressed him through a fast chain of cuts, high, center, low, recover, faint, return. He met them all, not perfectly, but cleanly enough. Then, as expected, the line opened for one sharp instant. He could have looked at her, could have checked, could have searched her eyes for the look that always told him he had reached something real. He did not. He stayed in the blade. He moved on feel, on structure, on the line itself. Their swords met. The opening closed in his favor. Unohana stepped back. The yard went quiet. He looked at her only after the exchange was done. And this time, when he saw the expression in her face, it did not pull him out of the fight. Because the moment that earned it was already behind him. Her smile then was small and devastating. Yes, she said. That was all. It was enough. He exhaled slowly. Unohana saw the understanding settle. You do not have to stop hearing me, she said. You only have to stop needing the sound before you trust the shape of the fight. He nodded once. Yes. That answer pleased her in a deeper way than the exchange had. He could see it. And now, because of the lesson, seeing it no longer endangered him. That mattered more than the approval itself. By the afternoon, the training shifted naturally. The lesson remained, but no longer had to be forced into him so cruelly. He had found the line, not mastered it. Found it. That was enough for one day. Enough for her to work on other corrections without losing the thread of this one. They sparred through the late light until the sun had tilted warm and low across the division. Several times he felt himself start to drift toward her expression or the sound of her voice, and each time caught it sooner. Not by shutting her out, by letting the fight remain first. She noticed every one of those recoveries. You caught yourself? Yes. How? I felt the blade leave first. A pause. Then her answer soft and exact. Good. Evening came. She dismissed him. He cleaned up, ate, and sat in his room with his sword across his lap, while darkness gathered beyond the window. Tonight the need for the moonlit hour came differently. Not as hunger, as pull. Something quieter, more certain. He returned to the yard because the day did not feel complete otherwise. When he arrived, Unohana was already there. Of course she was. She stood beside the practice rack, one hand resting lightly on the wood, expression unreadable at first. Then she saw him clearly, and something in her face shifted into the look she reserved only for these hours. You came back. Yes. You knew I would. A tiny tilt of her head. Yes. He stepped into the yard. This time they did not draw immediately. The moon hung clear and high. The division breathed softly around them. The stone beneath their feet held the memory of days' heat in faint traces. Unohana looked at him for a long moment, then asked, Do you know what changed today? He thought about it. Yes. What? He took a breath. I stopped trying to see whether you saw me while the fight was happening. Her eyes softened faintly. And knew you would if it was real there. Another truth. Unohana held his gaze as if testing the weight of the words. Then she stepped closer. Not enough to touch. Enough to make the space deliberate. Yes, she said quietly. That is part of trust too. He went still. Her voice in the moonlight did not feel like correction now. It felt like something laid carefully in his hands. You do not have to keep checking whether I am there, she continued. The words entered him so deeply and so cleanly that for one brief heartbeat he could not breathe around them. No one had ever said anything like that to him. Not once. Not in any form. Not in Rukongai, where everyone left or died or broke or turned ugly under pressure and showed him exactly how temporary every human thing could be. I am. Simple. Certain. Terrifying. He stood there in the moonlight and did not know what to do with the force of that answer. Unohana seemed to understand. She did not ask anything more of him. She only lifted a wooden blade and offered it. 1 hour. He took it. They began again. But the distance had changed. Not the physical distance. That was whatever the fight required. Something else. Some inner measure he had not known how to name before and perhaps still did not. Because tonight, for the first time, he stopped watching to see whether she remained, and simply fought from the knowledge that she did. Bleach, crimson Kenpachi. Chapter 9, the first time he stayed. The hour after that changed more than the fight. It changed the waiting. Before, when dusk lowered itself over Sarite and the ordered quiet of the 4th Division began to settle, he had gone back to the yard because he needed more training. Because the lessons did not feel finished. Because his body, once sharpened by battle, refused to let the day close cleanly without one more exchange beneath the moon. That was still true, but not fully. Now there was something else beneath it, not hunger, not even anticipation in its old simple form. Certainty. A quiet one. The kind that does not shout or burn or demand to be acknowledged. It simply exists, rooted and dangerous. By the 9th day, the certainty had taken shape inside him so completely that he no longer checked whether she would be there. He knew she would. And because he knew, something in him had begun to settle in ways he did not trust. That morning, the sky over Sarite wore a thin wash of pale cloud, soft enough to turn the light silver instead of gold. The training yard looked cooler under it. The stone held less warmth. The air carried the clean scent of water and cedar. He arrived before dawn. Unohana was already standing in the center of the yard. Of course she was. The sight no longer struck him as surprise. That should have alarmed him. It did, a little, but the alarm had become threaded with something steadier. She looked at him once, took in the exact set of his shoulders, the line of his jaw, the shape of his breathing, and said, You slept more deeply. He stopped a fraction too sharply. She noticed that too. You can tell? Yes, how? Unohana's expression did not change. You arrived less prepared to kill the morning. A beat passed. Then, despite himself, the corner of his mouth almost moved. Almost. Unohana saw it and let the faintest smile answer. You're adjusting? He frowned to cover the rest of whatever had nearly happened. I'm not getting soft, no, she said lightly. You're becoming less feral. That earned her a sharper look. She accepted it without any concern. The lesson that day began with speed. Not his, hers. She drew steel and gave him no opening speech, no gradual entry into correction. She simply moved, and the first strike came so fast that instinct answered before thought had time to fully form. He caught it, barely. The impact drove through both arms and down into his stance. Before he had recovered, she struck again from another angle. Then again, then again. It was not the wild speed of a reckless fighter trying to overwhelm. It was something far more refined and therefore much more brutal. Every strike arrived where his old habits would fail first. Every angle hunted the places where his survival instincts still pulled him toward collapse, overreaction, or impatient closure. For the first stretch of the morning, he did almost nothing but defend. That, more than the speed itself, infuriated him. He could survive it. He could learn inside it. He could even admire, somewhere under the sting of effort, the terrifying economy with which she dismantled his assumptions. But he hated yielding the shape of the fight so completely. Unohana knew that too. "Stop resenting the lesson," she said mid-exchange, her blade turning his aside and sliding close enough to threaten the throat before she withdrew it. "Use it?" He drove back at once, hard enough that the clash rang across the yard. She met it without effort. He pivoted into another angle. Still nothing. Another. Still nothing. The frustration sharpened. His foot slid half an inch too far. Her sword struck his shoulder. Too emotional. He stepped back, breath hard. "It's a fight." "Yes," she said. "Not an argument." That one landed deep enough to stay there. He came again, colder now. The change pleased her. He could hear it in the quieter, more focused shape of her breathing as the next series of exchanges began. Her blade still outpaced his. Her pressure still ruled the yard. But he had stopped trying to prove himself through every single motion, and because of that, the fight clarified. There, that word lived in him now, even when she did not speak it. There, where anger wasted force. There, where pride pulled the shoulders too tight. There, where wanting too much from one exchange made the next one weaker. He learned to let those realizations pass through him without turning each into its own fresh frustration. That alone made him harder to shake. By midday, she had him working at a level of sustained pressure he had never faced before. Not in Rukongai. Not in the first days here. Not even in the moonlit sessions where her voice had begun entering the fight and changing it from within. This was simpler. Crueler. Stay whole. No matter how long the exchange lasts, no matter how many corrections arrive, no matter how often she proves she can still reach him before he fully sees the path. Stay whole. That was the lesson. And when he finally did force her into a real defensive adjustment late in the afternoon, just one brief, clean moment where his blade and timing entered the line strongly enough to make her shift rather than merely redirect, he understood why she had driven him so hard all day. Because the opening had not come from speed, or anger, or desperation. It had come from endurance. He had remained. He had not broken the shape of himself to chase the finish. Unohana's eyes met his over crossed steel. There was approval there, yes, but something more than that too. Recognition, not new recognition, deeper, as if some second threshold inside her understanding of him had quietly opened. When they broke apart, she lowered her sword only slightly and said, "Again." He almost smiled at that. Almost. If only followed should have been like the others. He should have cleaned himself, eaten, sat alone for a while with the day's lessons replaying through muscle and thought, then returned to the yard because moonlight had become another kind of training. Instead, something altered. After the meal, after the room had gone dark around him, and he had sat long enough with his sword across his lap to feel the day settling into memory, he stood, and then did not immediately leave. He looked around the small room, at the futon, at the folded cloth, at the narrow window where the first hint of moonlight had begun to silver the frame. He realized, with a kind of quiet disbelief, that the room no longer felt like a place he was temporarily surviving inside. It felt occupied, by him. He did not know how to react to that. So he left before the thought could root itself too deeply. The training yard waited in moonlight. Unohana was there, but tonight she was not standing. She sat at the edge of the stone border beneath the nearest lantern, one leg folded, one hand resting lightly over the other in her lap. She was looking across the yard when he arrived, not upward this time, not lost in some private horizon he could not reach, simply present. When she heard him, her gaze shifted to him at once. "You came, yes." But he did not step immediately into the center of the yard. He stopped near the boundary. Something about that made her attention sharpen. "What is it?" He did not know how to answer that. So he said the truest piece. "Nothing." Unohana studied him for a long second. Then, with that same infuriating precision she brought to every lesson, she answered, "That isn't true." He could have refused her, could have deflected, turned the exchange into something sharper and simpler, hidden again inside the easy shape of defensiveness. Instead, he looked at her. The lantern light touched one side of her face. The rest belonged to moonlight and shadow. And because the hour had become what it had become, because her voice had already gone too deep into him to be treated like a simple tool, because she had told him "I am," and he had not yet recovered from what that meant, he said. I didn't leave as quickly tonight. Unohana went still, not startled, listening. No, she said softly. You didn't. The silence that followed was unlike the others. Not tense, not uncertain. It was the silence of a truth both had recognized at the same time and neither wished to mishandle. He took another step into the yard. Then another. But instead of going to the center and taking his place across from her, he stopped near where she sat. Close enough that if this had been anyone else, any captain, any stranger, any person from Rukungai or Serite or anywhere else in any world, his body would already have been angled half toward retreat or violence. It wasn't. That realization struck him quietly and all the way through. Unohana noticed everything in the shift of his posture. The room feels different now, she said. He looked at her sharply. Again. Always. She saw too much. Yes, he admitted after a beat. How? He frowned slightly because the answer was harder to say than the truth of it should have been. It feels like I'm supposed to be there. Her gaze did not move from his face. Not pity. Never pity. Something lower, gentler, and therefore infinitely more dangerous. Yes, she said. That was all. No elaborate reassurance. No careful softening. Just yes. Spoken as if the fact itself should never have been in question. He stood very still. The night breeze passed through the yard, stirring the edges of her sleeve and the loose strands of his hair alike. Then Unohana did something unexpected. She lifted the wooden sword from beside her, not as an offering across distance, but as if making room. Sit, he hesitated. Not because he feared it, because he did not understand it. Unohana's expression remained calm. You don't have to stand like you're waiting for the yard to become a battlefield. He glanced once across the moonlit stone, then at her. Then slowly he sat, not too near, near enough. The distance between them was no longer the one he would have left for a captain, nor the one he would have left for safety. It was something stranger, shaped not by protocol or suspicion, but by instinct finding its own measure. For a little while, neither of them spoke. The night carried on around them. Somewhere farther into the division, footsteps crossed a corridor and faded. Water moved through stone channels. A distant wind touched the eaves and moved on. At last, Unohana asked, Do you know what changed today? He thought about the morning. The afternoon? The way her speed had forced him to stop mistaking intensity for structure. The one clean opening earned only because he had stayed in himself long enough for it to appear honestly. Yes, what? I remained. Her eyes softened. Yes. He looked down at his hands resting over his knees. I've always remained. No, Unohana said quietly. You survived. He looked up. Her voice stayed gentle, but the words cut with the same exactness as ever. That is different, he said nothing. Because yes, he had survived everything. Hunger, knives, men larger than him, nights without shelter, mornings with no reason to believe they would be better. He had remained alive, but remaining inside a fight, inside himself, without letting fear, anger, loneliness, or the need to be seen drag him out of shape. That was new. Unohana saw the understanding settle. It is one thing to live through a battle, she said, another to be fully present within it. The words moved through him slowly. Then he asked, Why does that matter so much to you? There. Another thing said before he could decide whether to protect it. Unohana's gaze turned away from him then, drifting across the moonlit yard. For a long while she did not answer. When she did, her voice had changed. Not weaker, quieter, older somehow. Because, she said, most people break long before they die. He held still. The night seemed to deepen around the sentence. Unohana's face remained turned toward the yard, but he could see the line of her expression in profile. Calm, yes, yet carrying something distant underneath it. Not sadness. Something sharper, more enduring. I have watched it happen too many times, she continued. Fear, pain, weakness, the need to be loved, the need to be right, the need to win. Something always enters, and the fighter stops being whole. Her eyes lowered slightly. They become smaller than the blade they are holding. He did not know what to say to that. He had seen versions of it, of course. In the streets, in the districts. Fighters who crumbled the moment death truly reached them. Men who became crueler the more afraid they were. People whose hands betrayed them because they had never belonged fully to themselves to begin with. But in her voice now, he heard something larger. Centuries of disappointment, centuries of battle, centuries of waiting for someone who would not reduce under pressure. The hollow place in his chest stirred, not from the wound of loneliness, from recognition. "I don't want to become smaller," he said. Unohana turned back toward him. The look in her eyes then was soft enough to be dangerous. "No," she said. "You don't." Silence. Then, because the truth had already gone this far, and because the moonlit hour had become the one place in his life where unfinished honesty no longer always felt like weakness, he added, "I think I stop leaving the fight when you're in it." The words entered the quiet between them and stayed there. Unohana did not move, neither did he. At last she asked, "Why?" He looked away first this time, toward the open yard where moonlight lay over stone like pale water. "Because when you're in front of me, the fight matters in the right way. Because your voice steadies things that used to tear me apart. Because I want the version of me that appears under your blade to keep existing. Because when you look at me after I do something right, I don't feel like something stray and nameless for a moment." He had only one sentence he could survive saying, "Because it feels like you won't let me." Unohana's answer came so softly he almost missed it. "I won't." He turned toward her at once. She was looking at him directly now. No smile, no mask, just certainty. "You have spent too long learning how to disappear inside survival," she said. "I will not allow you to become less than what you are while I am holding the blade in front of you." The force of that moved through him with frightening clarity. He had no defense for it, no habit strong enough to turn it aside. So he stayed there in the moonlight, breathing evenly only because years of control forced the body into obedience even when the inside of him had gone strange and bright. Unohana watched him endure the answer. Then mercifully she shifted the shape of the moment before it split him open entirely. She lifted the practice sword and rose. 1 hour. He stood too, but not immediately. Stood the place beside her on the stone where he had just been sitting, at the yard, at her, at the fact that for those quiet minutes, he had not felt the need to keep half his body turned toward escape. That was new. So new it almost frightened him more than anything else she had taught. Unohana saw the thought cross his face. "Yes," she said before he asked. He frowned. "Yes, what?" "Yes." That changed too. Then she stepped into the center of the yard and raised the wooden blade. The hour that followed felt different from all the others. Not because the lessons softened. They did not. She corrected him mercilessly when his concentration drifted, punished impatience the instant it entered his stance, and drove him through long sequences of movement that demanded more and more of the steadiness he had only just begun to claim. But something underneath the hour had settled. For the first time, he did not feel like someone visiting the edge of her world by permission. He felt not equal, not close to that, but placed, as if, somewhere without words, something between them had accepted that he would remain. And because of that, his body moved differently. Cleaner, quieter, more certain of the line it occupied. Halfway through the hour, he forced her into another real step back. Small, clean, undeniable. Unohana smiled when it happened. And this time, he did not chase the look. He simply stayed in the fight and let the fact of it exist. When she finally ended the hour, he lowered the wooden sword and did not speak. He did not need to. He carried the weapon back to the rack and returned to her. For a second, they only stood there in the moonlight. Then Unohana said, very quietly, "You stayed." He looked at her. Yes, the answer meant more than the fight, more than the hour. She knew it. So did he. She had to leave. She did not stop him, but her voice followed him across the edge of the yard. Tomorrow, he looked back. Unohana stood where the moonlight cut across white cloth and dark hair, calm and impossible and somehow no longer distant in the same way. Yes, he said. And for the first time since entering Sirite, the room he returned to did not feel like shelter. It felt like a place he would come back from. Bleach Crimson Kenpachi. Chapter 10. The night he said her name. By the 10th day, the 4th Division had begun to understand that whatever Captain Unohana was doing in the training grounds was no longer ordinary instruction. No one said it openly. The division was too disciplined for gossip to grow careless near her presence. Orders were still obeyed, reports still delivered, patients still treated, halls still cleaned, bandages still folded with the same precise care they had always known. Serete remained Serete, structured, watchful, composed. But people watched. They watched the nameless boy crossing the courtyards before dawn with a sword at his side and bruises in the lines of his posture that never seemed to slow him. They watched him returning from training with the strange stillness of someone who had been torn apart and put back together properly. They watched him at night too, though from farther away, because by now even the boldest of the 4th Division had learned that there was a different atmosphere around the moonlit yard. Something private, something sharp, and something dangerous enough that decent survival instinct advised distance. He noticed all of it. He no longer cared. That alone would have frightened the version of him that once lived in Rukungai. The boy from the outer districts had cared about every look because every look might become a threat. Every silence might mean someone was circling behind him. Every curious gaze could ripen into violence if left unchecked. Now he passed through those same glances and felt them for what they were. Not danger, curiosity, unease. Respect beginning where fear had first rooted itself. It changed nothing in him that mattered. Only one gaze mattered now, and that truth had become too obvious to deny. The thought was still in him when he entered the yard that morning. Unohana was already there, of course. She stood with her blade still sheathed, hands resting loosely within her sleeves, the pale morning light turning the white of her captain's hari almost silver. A thin veil of mist clung to the edges of the courtyard stones, not enough to obscure, only enough to soften the lower air. He stopped a few steps from her. She looked at him, then, very calmly said, "You're quieter." He frowned. "I always am no." Her gaze remained on his face. "You are quieter in a different way." He said nothing, because he knew exactly what she meant. It was not silence. He had always been silent. This was something else. He no longer felt the need to brace himself every moment he stood near her. No longer needed to make himself hard before entering the yard. No longer carried his wariness like armor in every exchange. The tension in him had not vanished. It had settled. Dangerously, that was what she meant. Unohana saw the understanding arrive and let it remain between them for a moment before she drew her sword. "Today," she said, "you learn what still tightens in you when it no longer needs to." He raised his own blade. "That sounds worse than usual." A small smile touched her mouth. "Yes." Then she moved. The lesson began with pressure, but not the clean aggression of prior mornings. Unohana attacked in waves, fast, then slower, then sharp again, changing pace often enough that instinct alone could not carry him cleanly through the sequences. She was no longer only testing his timing or structure. She was listening to the body beneath the structure. Every unnecessary tension became a target. When his wrist tightened too soon, her blade struck the flat of his and sent force jarring through the joint. When his shoulders lifted before impact, she stepped past the line entirely and made him turn more sharply than needed to recover. When his jaw set too hard and narrowed his breathing, she drove him through an extended exchange until the flaw punished him from the inside instead of through her sword. Within the first hour, he realized what she was doing. She was hunting the remnants, not the old glaring weaknesses. Those had already been dragged out and cut across the previous days. This was subtler, more invasive. She was looking for the places Rukungai still lived in him when it no longer belonged. The part of him that expected punishment before praise. The part that reached for hardness the moment calm appeared. The part that still met steadiness with suspicion. Those things had once kept him alive.